I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the light was beginning to soften and the air cooled enough to carry that faint damp smell of earth. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that leaned slightly in different directions, some broken at their tops from storms years ago. The roof looked old but still held together. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the wooden boards on the outside were weathered to a dull gray. I had come out here because I wanted to be away from everything for a while. Life in the city had felt loud and crowded, and I thought a week in a small cabin would give me peace. I wasn't scared of the woods or being alone. I had done camping trips before, but this was different. This time I would be fully alone, with no other people around for miles. The place didn't have running water or electricity. I brought a cooler with food and a big container of water. I had a lantern, extra fuel, a sleeping bag, and enough clothes for a week. I felt prepared. The cabin itself was one single room with a small stove in the corner, a rough wooden table, a chair, and an old bed frame with a thin mattress. The floorboards creaked when I walked across them. There was a door that opened out the back to a small porch, but the boards there were warped and unstable. When I first stepped inside, it smelled like dust and wood that had been shut up for a long time. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the air felt stale. I opened the windows to let some air in, and for a while I just stood outside on the porch, breathing in the clean forest air, trying to let myself settle into the quiet. The first night passed without much trouble. I cooked some food on a small camping stove I brought, sat at the table, and ate while listening to the forest sounds outside. Crickets, the occasional call of a bird, and the faint rustle of branches when the wind passed through. I lay in the bed after, the mattress uneven and sagging in places, but I managed to sleep. The second day I explored around the cabin. I followed a trail that seemed barely used, just a thin line of dirt between thick undergrowth. It led down toward a creek. The water was shallow and cold, moving over smooth stones. I sat there for a while, listening to the flow and letting the sound fill the silence. But later that evening, when I walked back, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, just before the trees thickened, the ground had marks in the dirt. At first I thought it was just an animal, but the lines were too straight, too deliberate, almost like someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. The soil was torn up in two long streaks that led toward the trees and then disappeared into the shadows. I crouched down and looked at it closer. The marks weren't fresh, but they weren't very old either. The edges of the dirt were still sharp. It unsettled me, but I tried to tell myself it could have been a deer or maybe some equipment left by hunters. I went back inside the cabin and closed the door earlier than I had the first night. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. Every time the cabin creaked, I noticed it. When the wind brushed the trees, it sounded louder than before. I kept telling myself it was only because I was alone and my mind was paying too much attention. I eventually drifted off. On the third day, I decided to gather more wood for the stove. As I moved around the trees near the clearing, I found another strange thing. A pile of branches had been stacked together in a shape that looked too neat to be random. It wasn't far from the cabin, maybe 30 yards into the woods. The branches were leaned against each other in a cone shape, almost like a rough shelter, though it was too small for a person to use. It looked deliberate, but there was no sign of anyone around. I stood there for a long time, looking at it, feeling uneasy. I didn't want to touch it, so I walked back and gathered wood from another direction. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, but it pulled me from sleep. It sounded like something dragging across the ground, slow and steady. I froze in the bed, staring into the darkness, the only light a faint glow from the lantern I had left burning low. The sound went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. I waited, barely breathing, until I couldn't hear anything else. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. In the dirt near the porch, I saw new marks. They looked almost the same as the ones I had seen at the edge of the clearing, long grooves in the soil, like something heavy had been pulled. The marks stopped just short of the cabin and turned back toward the woods. I felt a tightness in my chest when I saw them. I walked around the clearing, looking in every direction, but the forest was still. The trees stood silent, the ground covered in fallen needles and leaves. There was no one there, at least no one I could see. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear dragging a log, maybe something else. But in the back of my mind, I didn't believe it. The days after that began to blur. I still went outside, still tried to enjoy the quiet, but I could never shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I would notice small things. A patch of dirt disturbed that hadn't been before. A stick broken clean in half and laid neatly across a rock. A faint smell of smoke in the air when I had not made any fire. At night, the noises came back. Sometimes it was dragging, sometimes it was a faint shuffle. Once I thought I heard something brushing against the wall of the cabin itself. Every time I forced myself to stay still, too afraid to move. I never saw anything, but the marks in the dirt always showed up the next day. I stopped sleeping well. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. My body stayed tense all night. When the first light came through the windows, I felt some relief, but it never lasted long. By the 6th day, I was worn down. My nerves were stretched thin. That morning, I found something that finally made up my mind. Behind the cabin, on the warped back porch, there was a footprint in the dust. Not an animal print, a shoe print. It was faint, but it was there, clear enough to know it was human. The problem was, I hadn't been on the back porch. The boards were so unstable I had avoided stepping there. That meant someone else had. I stood there staring at it, my throat dry, my mind racing. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been near the cabin, maybe more than once. They had been dragging things through the dirt, leaving strange arrangements in the woods, and walking right up close while I slept. I packed my things fast. I didn't care that I still had food and supplies left. I put everything back into my backpack, slung it over my shoulders, and left the cabin without looking back. I followed the trail to the creek, then kept going until I reached the dirt road where I had left my car. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the forest stayed empty. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, breathing hard, gripping the wheel. I didn't drive right away. I just sat, letting the tension drain enough so I could focus. In the end, I left the cabin behind and never went back. I never found out who had been there, what they had been dragging, or why they came so close at night. But the marks in the dirt and the print on the porch were real. I hadn't imagined them. Someone had been out there with me, moving through the trees, close enough to touch the cabin while I slept inside. That thought has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't the silence of the woods that scared me, or the darkness of the cabin. It was knowing that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Someone else had been watching, waiting, and I'll never know what would have happened if I had stayed even one more night. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Life in the city had been grinding me down in a way I couldn't quite explain. The noise, the people, the pressure of work, and the endless cycle of waking up, commuting, sitting in front of a screen, and repeating it all the next day had worn me out. I felt like I was carrying something heavy inside my chest all the time. I needed a break, and not just the kind where you go out with friends or take a weekend at home. I wanted a real break, something far away from people, something where I could just sit in silence and hear nothing but the wind in the trees. I found the cabin by accident. It wasn't a popular rental, not one of those modernized getaway homes with Wi-Fi, hot tubs, and wide decks for Instagram photos. It was old, plain, and tucked away deep in the woods in the northern part of the state. The pictures online were grainy and probably taken years ago, but something about it appealed to me. It looked quiet. It looked empty. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive out there took longer than I thought. The main roads turned into smaller ones, then those became cracked pavement, and finally it was just a dirt track that stretched out through thick trees on either side. The kind of road where you keep wondering if you missed a turn. My car jolted over ruts, and dust rose up behind me in the mirror. There was no cell service once I got a few miles down that dirt path. My GPS screen froze, leaving me with only the directions I had printed out before leaving. I was grateful I had done that, though a part of me laughed at how old-fashioned it felt. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that seemed to crowd close together, their tops swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. The cabin was made of dark, weathered wood. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the steps up to the porch looked uneven. There was a small shed off to the side, its door slightly crooked, and a rusted metal barrel beside it that looked like it had been used for burning trash. No vehicles, no other houses, no signs of life around. Just the cabin, the trees, and me. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and stepped out into the silence. That silence was the first thing that made my skin prickle. In the city, even at night, there's always noise, cars, voices, distant hums. Here there was nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves, the faint cry of some bird in the distance. It was the kind of silence where you hear your own heartbeat and your footsteps sound far too loud. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. It was one room with a small kitchen area against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a bed tucked near the window. The floor creaked under my steps. Cobwebs hung in the corners. It wasn't dirty, but it felt like nobody had been there in a long time. The air was heavy, like it hadn't been moved around in years. I unpacked a few things, set them on the bed, and looked around. There was no electricity, no running water, just a couple of old oil lamps and a stack of firewood by the stove. I had brought enough supplies with me: cans of food, bottled water, a flashlight, batteries, and some basic camping gear. I wanted isolation, and I had found it. The first evening passed slowly. I sat on the porch as the sun went down, listening to the woods settle into darkness. The shadows stretched long, and the air grew cooler. By the time it was fully dark, the only light came from the small lantern I had set beside me. Beyond its glow was nothing but blackness. The trees turned into a wall of dark shapes, and the silence grew thicker. That was the first time I realized how different real darkness is compared to what we get in the city. There, even in the dead of night, the sky glows faintly, streetlights throw halos on the ground. Windows shine here and there. Out here, the dark is complete. When I turned off the lantern for a moment, it was like being swallowed. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The forest seemed to press closer around me. My chest tightened until I lit the lantern again. I told myself I'd get used to it. The first night's sleep was rough. Every little sound outside seemed magnified. The crack of a branch, the distant rustle of leaves, something moving through the undergrowth. I kept reminding myself it was just animals, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But every sound made me open my eyes and stare at the ceiling. The days passed slowly after that. I spent time chopping wood, exploring a little around the cabin, reading the books I had brought, and sitting on the porch just watching the forest. It was peaceful in a way, but also unsettling. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed small details I had missed at first. There were marks on the trees near the cabin. Not scratches from animals, but cuts. Straight, vertical lines, as if someone had taken a knife or hatchet to the bark. Some trees had several of these lines, all at about the same height. I also found things in the woods that didn't feel right. A pile of stones arranged in a circle, moss growing on them but still stacked too neatly to be natural. A piece of rope half buried in the dirt, frayed and rotting. Once, while walking, I found what looked like the remains of a campsite. Burnt wood, a rusted can, and scraps of fabric half buried in the soil. It looked old, abandoned years ago, but I couldn't shake the feeling of standing where someone else had stood long before me. At night, the unease grew worse. I began to hear things that didn't sound like animals. Footsteps in the leaves, slow and heavy, pausing and then continuing. I'd sit up in bed, holding my breath, straining to hear, but when I looked out the window, there was only darkness. One night, I was sure I heard something brushing against the wall of the cabin. A slow drag, like fabric or a hand moving along the wood. My whole body went cold. I gripped the flashlight and sat still until the sound stopped. In the morning, when I forced myself to check, I didn't see anything, no marks, no footprints. The more nights that passed, the worse it became. Sleep turned into something shallow and broken. My nerves felt raw. Every creak of the cabin, Every snap of a twig outside set me on edge. The woods no longer felt empty. They felt watched. On the 5th day, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Near the shed, behind the cabin, the dirt looked disturbed. At first, I thought it was just an animal digging. But when I looked closer, I saw shapes in the soil, like old holes that had been filled in again. Not small ones, big, long ones, almost the size of a person lying down. I tried not to think about it. I told myself they were just trenches for something, or maybe old garbage pits. But once I saw them, I couldn't stop imagining things buried there. That night, the footsteps came again, closer than before. This time, I didn't just hear them outside. I heard them on the porch, the slow, deliberate creak of the boards under weight. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I gripped the flashlight, too afraid to move. The steps stopped just outside the door. I waited, frozen, every muscle screaming, until eventually, after what felt like forever, the sound faded away. I didn't sleep at all after that. By the 7th day, I had made up my mind. I was leaving in the morning. The peace I had come for was gone. I packed most of my things, leaving only what I would need overnight. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, that isolation had gotten into my head, that the silence and darkness had twisted normal sounds into threats. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. That final night was the worst. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they didn't stop at the porch. I heard the faint creak of the steps, then the slow scrape along the wall again. My throat was dry, and I could barely breathe. The sound circled the cabin, slow and patient. Then, for a moment, it stopped by the window near the bed. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared up into the darkness, listening to my heart pound. The sound lingered there, then moved away. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle stiff from fear. When the sky finally lightened, I wasted no time. I grabbed my bag, stuffed the rest of my things inside, and got out. The air outside felt heavy, the woods too quiet. I kept my eyes on the car as I walked toward it, every step tense, expecting to see something move in the trees. When I turned the key and the engine started, I felt a surge of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I pulled out of the clearing fast, the tires spitting dirt, and didn't look back. The drive back felt endless, but with each mile, the air felt lighter. When I finally reached the paved road and saw another car pass by, the weight in my chest eased for the first time in days. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was someone living off the grid, someone who didn't want me there. Maybe it was worse than that. The disturbed earth behind the shed still lingers in my mind. The slow footsteps, the way they stopped by the window. Whatever it was, I was lucky to leave when I did. And I know I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. I thought it would be a break from the constant noise of the city and the routine that had started to feel like it was draining me. The cabin wasn't anything new. It had been there for years, built by some old hunter who used it long before it was rented out to people like me. It sat a good few miles off the nearest paved road, with a dirt trail that wound through tall trees until it ended right at the clearing where the small wooden place sat. The roof was metal, already showing patches of rust, and the wood on the outside was gray from years of sun and rain. It wasn't fancy at all, but that was the point. I wanted quiet, and here it was. When I first arrived, the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The cabin was one room with a small bathroom added on, nothing more. It had a wood stove for heat, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, and a counter with a few shelves above it. There was no running water except for a pump outside, and no electricity except for a small solar unit that could run a couple of lights. I had brought enough food for the week, most of it dry or canned stuff, and I kept everything in sealed bins. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later I would regret how I stored everything. The first day was quiet. I unloaded my car, set things up inside, and then went walking around the clearing just to get a sense of the place. The forest pressed in thick from all sides, the trees tall and close together. I noticed animal tracks near the edge of the clearing, mostly deer, some raccoon, and maybe coyote. I had read before I came that bears moved through these woods too, but I didn't see anything that looked like bear tracks. I told myself I would keep an eye out, but I wasn't too worried. I had food sealed and I planned to keep it inside. That night I made a fire outside, sat beside it as the sun dropped down, and listened to the way the forest came alive. It was noisy with insects at first, then the sounds shifted to owls calling and something small moving through the brush. It felt normal, like the kind of wilderness sound you expect when you go camping. The stars were brighter than I had seen in a long time. By the time I went inside and shut the cabin door, I felt calm, like I had made the right choice to come. The second night was when I noticed the first thing that felt off. I woke up to a noise outside. It was a slow scraping sound, almost like something rubbing against the wood of the cabin. I laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. It didn't last long. After maybe 30 seconds it stopped, and the forest went quiet again. I told myself it was probably a branch shifting in the wind or some animal brushing against the wall. I drifted back off to sleep, but the sound stuck with me the next morning. I went outside and walked around the cabin, looking for anything strange. On the far side, near the back, I saw faint marks on the wood. They were long and shallow, not deep enough to be claw marks, but still there. I bent down and ran my fingers across them, trying to think of what could have made them. I didn't have an answer, but I shrugged it off. That day, I went for a hike on one of the old logging trails. I was gone for hours, moving further into the forest than I probably should have alone, but I wanted to explore. The trees felt endless, the trail winding deeper until it was hard to even remember which way I had come from. I kept track by noticing bends in the trail, fallen logs, anything I could mark in my mind. When I finally came back in the afternoon, I felt tired but good. The clearing looked peaceful again, like nothing could go wrong here. That night, though, I heard noises again. This time it was heavier, like something moving outside. The sound of slow steps in the dirt around the cabin. I froze on the bed, every muscle tight, listening. I didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe too loudly. The steps circled once, maybe twice, then faded. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw nothing but the moonlight hitting the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe curious, maybe sniffing around. I held on to that thought until I managed to sleep. The next morning, I checked the ground. Sure enough, there were tracks, but they weren't deer. They were boots, a man's boot prints, clear in the dirt, circling the cabin, coming right up to the steps, then walking back toward the trees. My stomach dropped when I saw them. The nearest house was miles away, and nobody was supposed to be out here. Whoever it was had been close enough to reach out and touch the door if they wanted to. I stood there in the morning light, staring at the prints, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe just someone passing through. But the prints circled. They weren't going anywhere. They were just checking, watching. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me said I was overreacting. Whoever it was, maybe they were gone now. That day, I tried to distract myself. I chopped wood, pumped water, kept busy with anything I could do. I stayed close to the cabin, though. I didn't go hiking again. Every time I stepped out to the edge of the clearing, I looked into the trees, scanning for movement. By evening, I was worn out from the constant edge of tension I felt. I tried to eat dinner and act like it was normal, but my hands shook while I opened the can. That night, I barred the door with a piece of wood I found, even though the lock already worked. I lay down in bed but barely slept. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slower, deliberate, crunching in the dirt outside. I sat up, holding my breath. The sound moved past the window, then stopped. The silence felt heavier than anything else. Then I heard it, a soft thud, like someone trying the door. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might pass out. The bar held, the door didn't move, but the sound of that pressure against it froze me. After a few seconds, it stopped. The footsteps shifted away, fading into the woods again. When morning came, I went outside and saw fresh prints. They were all over now, not just circling once, but pacing back and forth, stopping near the door, near the windows. Whoever it was had spent time there, close in the dark. My mind raced with fear and anger. Someone was stalking me, playing with me, testing how far they could go. I thought about leaving again, but I was deep out there. The dirt trail back to the main road was rough and long, and my car wasn't in the best shape. The idea of breaking down halfway out was almost worse. I told myself I would wait one more day. Maybe it was done. Maybe they were just passing through. I wanted to believe that. That day was long. I barely stepped outside except to grab wood. I kept looking out the window, scanning the treeline, certain I would see someone standing there. Hours dragged by. My food tasted like nothing. My hands shook when I poured water, and every creak of the cabin made me flinch. That night, it escalated. I heard the footsteps again, but this time there was more than one set. 2, maybe 3. They moved around the cabin, slow and heavy, crunching the dirt, breaking sticks. I gripped the edge of the bed, my body frozen. Then came the sound of scratching on the wood again, long and slow, like fingers dragging along the wall. My throat tightened, and I forced myself not to make a sound. Then I heard something else. A soft tap on the glass of the window, just one. My body felt cold all over. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared into the dark until the sounds finally drifted away. In the morning, I checked again. More prints. At least 3 people this time, boots of different sizes, all circling, stopping near the windows, near the door. The scratching marks were deeper now, fresh. I knew I couldn't stay anymore. I packed everything fast, throwing it into bins and bags, hardly caring how messy it was. I loaded the car with shaking hands, every second feeling like someone was about to step out of the woods. I left the cabin in daylight, driving fast down the dirt road, every bump and rut jarring me. My eyes kept flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the paved road, I didn't stop. I drove until I hit the next town, parked at a gas station, and sat there breathing hard, my hands gripping the wheel. The fear still clung to me like sweat. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told the story to the rental office, they brushed it off, said it was probably hunters passing through. But I know what I saw. I know how close they came, circling, tapping, scratching. They weren't just passing. They were waiting, testing. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think the door or the bar across it would have been enough. I had been looking forward to spending a few quiet days alone in the small cabin that I had rented for the week. It was tucked away deep in the valley, surrounded on all sides by dense forest and steep hills that made the place feel cut off from everything else. The dirt road leading in had been narrow and rough, forcing me to take it slow with my old truck. By the time I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun had already dipped low behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was small and simple, built from dark logs that had weathered with age. A single porch wrapped around the front, with a few steps leading down to the packed dirt yard. The air was cool, even though it was late summer, and the woods around me were quiet in that heavy way that only deep country places can be. I unloaded my supplies, 2 bags of food, a sleeping bag, a lantern, extra water, and a small axe for chopping wood. Inside, the cabin had just one room with a bed pushed against the wall, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner. The smell inside was old wood and dust, but not unpleasant. At first, everything felt normal, even peaceful. I liked the quiet, the lack of noise from the world I had left behind. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, lit the lantern, and listened to the forest sounds outside as I ate. But after a few hours, as the night got darker and the lantern's glow became the only light, I noticed how heavy the silence felt when the crickets stopped chirping. It wasn't something I thought about much at first, but when the sounds of the forest went quiet all at once, it felt wrong. Like something was moving nearby and all the smaller animals had gone still. I brushed it off, telling myself it was only my nerves from being alone out here. I was used to the noise of people, traffic, and lights. Being in a cabin alone in the woods was different. But as I lay down in the bed, listening to the old boards creak under my weight, I kept thinking about how quiet it was outside. I thought I heard faint crunches in the dirt near the porch, like footsteps, but I reminded myself animals could move like that too. The first night passed without incident, though I woke up several times to the sound of something shifting outside. Each time I sat up and listened, holding my breath in the darkness, but the noises would fade away. By morning, sunlight filled the cabin through the single window, and everything seemed harmless again. I shook off the unease and went outside to gather wood for the stove. The second day was calm. I walked down the dirt road for about a mile, just to see how isolated the place really was. There were no other cabins in sight, no houses, no fences, just thick forest on either side. The road itself wound off into the distance and disappeared around a bend, but I didn't see another vehicle or person the whole time I was out. That isolation felt good during the day, but I kept thinking about how it would feel once the sun went down again. Back at the cabin, I split wood for a few hours and kept myself busy. As the evening fell, I made sure the door was locked and the lantern was filled. The second night was when the unease started to feel more serious. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, without knowing why. The cabin was dark except for the dim glow of the lantern, which I had turned down low. I lay there listening, and after a while I caught the sound again, soft, deliberate steps in the dirt just outside the cabin. They were too slow and careful to be an animal. They would crunch forward a little, then stop, then crunch again. My mouth went dry as I stared at the door, trying to convince myself it wasn't what I thought it was. I didn't move from the bed, afraid that any sound would give me away. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded toward the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling until daylight returned. When the sun came up, I checked the dirt outside the cabin. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed the faint shape of a boot print near the steps of the porch. My stomach sank. It was too large and too even to belong to any animal. Someone had been walking outside during the night. I tried to tell myself it could have been a hunter passing by, but the cabin was so far off the road that it didn't make sense for someone to wander so close. The thought of someone circling the cabin while I slept made my chest tight. I carried the axe with me the rest of the day, even when I was just sitting inside. The third night was worse. I barely managed to fall asleep, but when I did, I woke to the same crunching noises outside. This time they were closer, circling the cabin slowly, moving from one side to the other. The old wood walls were thin, and every creak of the boards outside felt like they were right beside me. At one point, I heard the faintest sound of the door handle moving, like someone was testing it. My whole body froze, my hand gripping the axe so tight that my knuckles hurt. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until after what felt like hours, the noises stopped again. In the morning, I went outside and found more boot prints, this time clearer. They circled the cabin in a wide loop, stopping near the door and then moving off into the woods. I followed them a short way, but the tracks disappeared into the undergrowth. Whoever it was knew the land well enough to move through it without leaving much trace. That day I thought about leaving. I had enough food and water to stay, but the idea of another night with someone out there watching me felt unbearable. The problem was, the road back was long and rough, and I wasn't sure if my old truck would make it easily. I told myself I'd leave the next morning, when I could drive out in daylight. That final night was the worst. I tried to prepare by keeping the lantern bright and the axe at my side. I even stacked some furniture against the door, though the cabin was so flimsy it wouldn't matter much if someone really wanted to get in. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time they didn't circle quietly. Whoever it was walked heavily onto the porch, boards creaking under the weight, and stayed there. The door handle rattled harder, then stopped. For long minutes, there was only silence, and then a slow, dragging sound along the wall, as if they were running something across the logs. My chest felt like it would burst from the pressure. I thought about yelling, but my voice caught in my throat. I knew there was no one to hear me anyway. Eventually, the sounds faded into the woods again, but I couldn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the first light of dawn touched the trees, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I just stuffed everything into the truck and started down the dirt road as fast as it would go. Every time I looked in the mirror, I expected to see someone behind me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the paved highway, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told a few people about it, they said it was probably a hunter or a drifter passing through, maybe someone curious. But I know what I heard. Someone walked around that cabin for 3 nights, testing the door, dragging their hand across the walls, circling me while I lay inside. I left with the thought that if I had stayed just one more night, the door might not have held. Whoever it was wasn't just passing by. They knew I was alone, and they were waiting. I had always told myself that spending a week alone in a cabin would help me reset my head. Life had been moving too fast, and I thought isolating myself far from people, from noise, from constant screens and buzzing phones would make me feel calmer. I wanted to slow everything down. When I booked the cabin, the idea seemed simple. A week away, no internet, no neighbors, just a lake, some old pine trees and silence. When I arrived, the gravel road leading in was rougher than I expected. My car bounced against deep ruts, and the tall grass brushed against the sides of the vehicle. I saw the cabin after a long curve in the road, tucked into the trees. It was smaller than the pictures had shown, with dark wood siding that had faded from years of weather. The roof sagged a little in the middle. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. Inside, it smelled like old wood, faint mildew, and a bit of ash from the fireplace. The furniture was basic. A couch with sunken cushions, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a bed that squeaked when I pressed on it. Everything looked older than I had expected, but it was clean enough. I set down my bags and walked to the windows. From the front one, I could see the dirt path I had come up. From the back, I could see a slope leading down to the lake, the water flat and reflecting the gray sky above. At first, I felt calm. That first evening, I sat by the lake with a chair I found on the porch. I listened to the wind moving through the trees. I watched ripples spread out on the surface of the water. I thought about how quiet it really was, how I couldn't hear cars or voices or anything that usually filled the background of my life. I cooked a simple meal that night on the old gas stove inside, then lay in bed reading until the light outside faded away. The first night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep well. The cabin was too quiet. Every small sound stood out. The creak of the walls, the occasional tap of a branch against the window, the distant call of some night bird. I woke several times, each time staring into the dark corners of the room, listening. The next day, I tried to settle into a routine. I made breakfast, hiked around the area, and came back to read and write in a notebook I had brought. It was peaceful during the day, but every now and then I felt a prickle in the back of my neck, as if someone were nearby watching me. I would glance into the trees, scan the shadows, and then force myself to laugh it off. It was just nerves, I told myself. My brain wasn't used to this much silence. That evening, as the sun sank low, I sat again by the lake. The air grew cooler. I noticed then what bothered me. The woods behind me always felt heavy, as if something could be standing just a few feet back, hidden by the trees. I tried not to turn around too much, but I couldn't shake the thought. When I finally went back to the cabin, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. The second night was worse. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. A crunch, like a footstep on gravel or dry leaves. My eyes opened, and I lay perfectly still. I told myself it might have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. I held my breath and listened. After a few seconds, I heard another crunch, closer this time. Then silence. My heart began to pound, and I felt my body tense up. I waited, staring into the darkness, until finally I drifted back to sleep out of sheer exhaustion. In the morning, I went outside and walked slowly around the cabin. I checked the ground but couldn't see much, just scattered pine needles and patches of dirt. Still, I had a tight feeling in my chest as I moved around the property. By the third day, I was on edge. The cabin no longer felt like a safe retreat. It felt like a box I was stuck inside, with windows that let anything outside see me easily. I sat by the table during the day, writing, but my eyes kept going to the window. At night, I made sure the door was locked and wedged a chair under the handle. That night, I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was moving outside. I could hear slow steps circling the cabin, leaves rustling, a faint scrape against the wall near the porch. My body froze in the bed. I gripped the blanket so tight my knuckles hurt. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing every now and then. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? Or someone who knew I was here? Alone? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky turned pale, I packed a bag with essentials and carried it to the car. I thought about leaving right then, but something stopped me. The road out was long and I was tired. I convinced myself I would wait until the next morning, after one more night of rest. That was a mistake. When evening came, I tried to keep busy. Cooked. I read. I even turned on the old radio I had found in a drawer, though it only caught static. But as night fell, the same tension filled me. I couldn't sit still. I turned off all the lamps so the cabin would be dark, then sat near the window, staring into the trees. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was holding my breath again. Hours passed in silence, until just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. My throat went dry. I stayed low, crouched by the window, trying to see outside without being seen. The night was dark, no moon, only the faint outline of trees against the sky. I thought I saw a shape move, but I couldn't be sure. The steps circled again, stopping near the back wall. Then I heard the door handle rattle. A jolt of terror shot through me. Someone was trying the door. The chair I had wedged under it groaned as the handle turned. My body went rigid, every muscle screaming to run, but I forced myself to stay still. After a long moment, the handle stopped moving. Silence again, then footsteps, retreating slowly into the night. I didn't move until dawn. My body shook from holding so much tension for so long. When the sun rose, I rushed outside, shoved my bag into the car, and tried to start the engine. It coughed, sputtered, and then went silent. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't catch. My heart sank. I popped the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. All I saw were wires and metal. I stood there, panic clawing at me, realizing I was trapped. The rest of that day was a blur. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting someone to step out. I stayed inside with a kitchen knife on the table beside me. I barely ate. The sun seemed to drop too fast, shadows stretching across the cabin. That night, the noises came back. This time there were more. Crunches, snaps, and faint rustles from several directions. My stomach twisted. I pressed myself against the floor, peeking under the curtains. I thought I saw movement, shapes shifting between trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. The steps came closer, surrounding the cabin. Then tapping started on the windows. Light, deliberate taps like someone brushing their fingers against the glass. First on one side, then another. My chest pounded so hard I thought I would pass out. I stayed on the floor all night, knife gripped tight, listening to the sounds move around me. I realized then how hopeless the cabin was. Thin walls, glass windows, one weak door. I was trapped in a box with no way out. When dawn came, the sounds stopped. The woods looked empty again. I forced myself outside, legs shaking, and walked to the car. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. On the dirt near the trees were clear footprints. Not animal prints, human, several sets, circling the cabin. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my bag, left the useless car behind, and started down the road on foot. I didn't care how far the nearest town was. I just wanted to be out of those woods. For hours I walked, ears straining at every sound behind me. I didn't stop. The sun climbed, then dropped lower. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I kept moving. Finally, near sunset, I reached a paved road. Relief nearly knocked me over. A passing truck slowed when it saw me, and the driver gave me a ride into town. I never went back for the car. I never called the cabin owner. I didn't want to explain, and I didn't want to know what would happen if I returned. Even now, when I think about that cabin, I don't picture the lake or the trees. I picture the prints in the dirt, dozens of them, circling, watching, waiting. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. I wanted time away from the noise, away from the constant movement of city streets and people talking over each other. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from anyone. I didn't even tell many people where I was going. I thought of it as a break, a reset. I told myself it would just be me, some food, and quiet. I imagined mornings filled with cold air, evenings by the fire, and long nights of silence. What I got was nothing close to that. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. My GPS lost signal an hour before I arrived, and I had to rely on a printed map I brought along, tracing the small lines with my finger as I drove through twisting forest roads. By the time I reached the gravel path leading to the cabin, I felt a weight in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something like the heavy awareness of being truly alone. I passed no other houses, no stores, not even a gas station for nearly 40 minutes before I reached the cabin. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by tall trees that bent in the wind. It looked old, not broken down, but worn. The wooden siding was dark, maybe stained or maybe just weathered. A small porch ran across the front, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. There was a single light above the door, though I knew it wouldn't turn on. The power wasn't connected here. The owner had told me that ahead of time. I would be using lanterns and a small generator if I needed electricity. I told myself that was part of the charm. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air smelled stale, like wood that had been shut up for too long. Dust floated in the narrow beam of sunlight coming through the window. The cabin was one large room with a bed against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs in the corner, and a wood stove near the middle. Against the back wall was a counter with a sink, but no running water. I had brought jugs with me, enough for a week. I also had food packed, mostly cans, dried goods, and things that didn't need to be cold. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked the firewood I had brought from the shed, and walked around the clearing. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. I sat on the porch as the sun went down and listened to the forest. It was strange at first, how loud silence could be when it was filled with the sounds of crickets, wind in the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch far off. I went to bed early, the kind of early you only do when you're cut off from everything. The first night, I woke up around midnight. I didn't know why at first. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was cold. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and lay still. That was when I realized I was listening. I wasn't fully awake, but some part of me had snapped to attention. Then I heard it. It was faint, like the sound of steps on leaves. Not close, but not far either. My eyes went to the window, but it was black outside. I tried to reason with myself. Animals moved around at night. Deer, raccoons, anything. I told myself it was normal, but my body didn't relax. My ears strained for the sound again. Came slow, like weight pressing down on the ground, then lifting, then pressing again. I stayed still for an hour, maybe more, before sleep dragged me back under. The next morning, I shook it off. I made coffee on the stove, ate breakfast, and went for a long walk. I followed a trail behind the cabin that wound through thick trees and led down toward a stream. I sat there for a while, listening to the water. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the time I returned, the sun was already sinking low. That night, I made sure the fire was stronger before I went to bed. I told myself I wouldn't wake up nervous again, but I did. It was the same thing, only this time I was sure of it. The sound was closer, slow, steady steps, the crunch of leaves. I lay frozen, every muscle tight. The sound circled, not right against the cabin, but moving around it. At times, I thought it was directly behind the wall where I lay. I wanted to get up and look out the window, but the idea of pressing my face close to the glass while something was outside stopped me. I stayed still until the sound faded. When the morning came, I went outside and walked the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then, near the edge where the trees began, I saw a mark. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and there, clear in the mud, was a footprint. Not a boot print, a bare foot. The size was too big to be a child's, and the toes were spread wide. I stared at it for a long time, telling myself it could be anything. Maybe a hunter who had come through before. Maybe someone messing around. But the thought of someone barefoot, walking near my cabin in the night, dug into me. The days passed the same. Quiet mornings, long afternoons, but every night the sound returned. Sometimes it was faint, sometimes close. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. I started keeping the lantern lit by my bed. One night, the steps came all the way onto the porch. I heard the wood creak under the weight. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door. I thought about the lock, how thin it was, how easy it would be for someone determined to break it. The steps stopped just outside. I didn't move until morning light pushed through the window. That morning, I walked the porch slowly. The boards were scuffed with dirt, as if something heavy had pressed against them. I found another footprint in the mud just off the steps. I wanted to leave right then, pack my things, get in the car, and drive. But I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I was here for quiet, for time alone, that it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. On the fifth night, I stayed awake. I sat at the table with the lantern low, listening. The steps came again, circling, slow and steady. I gripped the edge of the chair, my jaw tight. Then I heard something new, a scrape, faint but clear, along the wooden wall, like fingers dragging across it. My stomach turned to stone. I stayed there, unmoving, until the sound drifted away. By the sixth night, I was running on no sleep. My nerves were stretched thin. Every sound in the woods made me jolt. That night, I made a decision. I set my lantern in the corner, turned low, and positioned myself in the darkest part of the room, near the stove. I sat with the fire poker in my hand and waited. The steps came, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, closer this time. I held my breath, gripping the poker so tight my hand ached. The steps moved to the porch. The boards creaked. Then the handle of the door moved. The rattle was soft at first, then harder. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. The handle stopped. Silence stretched, heavier than anything I had ever felt. Then came the knock. Soft, slow, 3 times. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder. My body screamed at me to run, to shout, to do something, but I stayed still, clutching the poker. After a long time, the sound faded. The steps retreated. When morning came, I packed. I didn't care about the rest of the food or the firewood. I shoved what I could into my bags and loaded the car. My hands shook as I locked the cabin door behind me. The drive out was long, every turn of the gravel road feeling like something might be waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the weight in my chest lifted just enough to breathe again. I never found out who it was or why they came, but I know this. It wasn't random. The steps, the circling, the knock, they weren't accidents. Someone knew I was there. Someone wanted me to know they were there too. I never went back. I had been looking forward to spending a few days alone in the mountains, far away from traffic, phones, and the noise of the city. The cabin I had found was small, old, and isolated, about an hour drive off the main highway, reached by a dirt road that wound deeper and deeper into the forest. The listing had described it as a hunting cabin, nothing fancy, just the basics, but that was all I wanted. I needed quiet, and I thought it would be good for me to have a stretch of days where the only sounds would be the wind in the trees and the creaks of the wooden walls at night. The drive itself set the tone. After I left the paved road, the dirt path cut through thick woods. The trees stood close to the edges of the road, their branches bending over, making the sky narrow above me. My tires crunched over loose stones, and the car jolted whenever I hit a rut or a root that had worked its way up through the dirt. I passed no other cars, no houses, not even mailboxes. The deeper I went, the less I felt connected to the outside world. My phone signal had already dropped to nothing miles back, and I began to understand just how alone I was going to be out here. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked back behind a stand of pine trees. The roof was tin, rusting in places, and the wooden boards that made up the walls were darkened with age and weather. A small porch sat at the front with a single step leading up to it, and a door that leaned slightly on its hinges. The windows were small, with frames that looked like they hadn't seen paint in decades. There was a shed off to the side, even more weather-beaten, with its door half open as if the wind had pushed it. The clearing around the cabin was small, surrounded tightly by forest on every side, the trees pressing in close, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Inside, the cabin was just as plain as I expected. One main room with a wood stove, a narrow cot against the wall, a table and 2 chairs, and a counter with some shelves where canned food and old tools sat. There was a single door that led to a back room, smaller, where there was a second cot and some shelves lined with supplies left by whoever had last stayed there. The air inside had that dry, wooden smell of a place shut up too long, mixed with a faint sourness, like old damp clothes. Dust lay thick on the shelves, and cobwebs hung in the corners. At first, I felt a calm wash over me. I unpacked slowly, putting my bag on the cot and stacking the few groceries I'd brought onto the counter. I checked the stove, finding a pile of chopped logs stacked neatly outside under a sheet of tin, dry and ready to use. Felt right to be here. No phones, no noise, no demands. Just me and the forest. But that first night, I realized how deep the silence was. After the sun dropped, the trees outside became a black wall, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the cabin boards. When I blew out the lantern, the darkness was complete, heavy in a way I hadn't felt before. Every sound carried. The groan of the wooden beams as they cooled, the faint rustle of something in the underbrush outside, the tap of a branch against the side of the cabin. Lying on the cot, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, I felt the awareness of how far I was from anyone else. There was no hum of cars on a road, no distant lights, no voices. Just me, surrounded by endless forest. I told myself that was what I had come for, but the longer I listened, the more I realized the forest was not silent at all. It was full of small noises, a crack of twigs somewhere in the trees, a scrape against the wall outside, too heavy for a branch. At one point, I swore I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the cabin, slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat up on the cot, holding my breath, every sense sharpened. The stove had gone out hours ago, and the cold air seeped into the cabin, carrying with it every sound. I stared at the door, at the thin line of moonlight under it, waiting to see a shadow cross. Minutes stretched long. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, my body grew tired of the tension, and I lay back down. But I did not sleep well. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and scanned the clearing. The ground was covered with pine needles, soft and uneven, not the kind to hold clear prints. Still, I walked slowly around the cabin, checking the edges. Behind the cabin, where the trees grew tight, I noticed the ground had been disturbed. A patch of dirt and needles looked brushed over, as if someone had scuffed their foot across it to erase a mark. I felt a cold unease settle in me. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer moving close in the night, a bear maybe rooting around for food. But the thought of the footsteps I thought I heard came back to me. The sound had seemed measured, steady, not the shuffle of an animal. That day, I tried to distract myself. I chopped some wood, swept out the cabin, and hiked a short way into the woods to get a feel for the land around me. The trees were so dense that after only a short distance, the cabin was out of sight, hidden behind layers of trunks and branches. It made me realize how easy it would be to get lost here, how quickly a person could vanish into the forest without a trace. By the time I returned, the sun was already slipping lower. The air grew colder, and I started a fire in the stove, warming the cabin. The glow of the fire made the inside feel smaller but safer, the light pushing back the dark corners. I told myself I had been imagining things the night before, that isolation was making me nervous. But that second night, the noises returned. More definite this time. A thud against the side of the cabin. A scrape along the wall. The crunch of leaves just beyond the porch. I lay rigid on the cot, my heart hammering, staring at the dark shape of the door. I wanted to believe it was animals, but animals did not move like that. They did not circle a cabin slowly, pausing as though listening. At some point in the night, I heard the shed door slam shut. It had been hanging open when I arrived, the wind moving it, but this was different. This was forceful, sudden, as though someone had gripped it and pulled it closed. The next morning, I walked to the shed, my stomach tight with unease. The door was shut now, the old wood swollen in its frame. I pulled it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, stale and sharp, like old gasoline mixed with rot. Tools hung from nails on the walls, their metal orange with rust. In the corner, a pile of old tarps lay crumpled, stiff with age. But what caught my eye was the floor. In the dust and dirt, faint marks ran across the boards, not fresh but not old either. Long scuffs, as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor toward the back wall. I crouched down, staring at the boards. The scuffs disappeared under the tarps in the corner. I reached out and pulled one tarp aside. Beneath it, the boards looked cleaner, newer, as though they had been replaced. My chest tightened. I stood quickly, backing out of the shed. For the rest of the day, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing among them, still and silent. But the forest gave me nothing, just its endless depth and its whispering branches. That night, I barred the cabin door with one of the chairs. I kept the lantern burning low, the shadows flickering across the wooden walls. I lay on the cot, wide awake, listening, and I heard it again. Footsteps, this time clearer, slow, circling, then a pause directly outside the wall by my cot. The sound of breathing, faint but unmistakable, as if someone stood inches away on the other side of the boards. My skin prickled. I held my breath, terrified that the smallest sound from me would give me away, even though they had to know I was inside. The breathing lasted for long moments, then drifted away. The footsteps moved off into the trees. When the dawn came, I felt hollow, drained by a night of fear. I knew I should leave, pack my things, drive out, put the cabin behind me. But some pull held me back, a mix of stubbornness and the thought that maybe I was letting my imagination run too far. Still, I could not deny what I had heard. That afternoon, I went back to the shed. The scuffed floor, the replaced boards, they gnawed at me. I found a rusted pry bar hanging from the wall and knelt by the cleaner boards. I wedged the bar under one and pried. The nails squealed as they came up. When the board lifted, the smell of damp earth rose up, strong and sour. I pulled up another board, then another. Beneath the shed floor was a shallow pit, and in it, I saw what I had been dreading. A bundle of clothing, stained dark with old blood. A boot, cracked with age, its laces frayed. And bones, pale against the dirt, jumbled together in a way that could only mean one thing. I stumbled back, dropping the pry bar, my hands shaking. My mind reeled, trying to deny what my eyes had seen. But it was clear. Someone had died here. Someone had been buried. I had planned on staying in the old cabin for just 3 nights. It was supposed to be a quiet place to get away, surrounded by woods that stretched for miles, with no one around for at least an hour's drive. I had been working too much back in the city, barely sleeping, barely eating anything proper, and I thought maybe a stretch of silence with no phone reception and no internet would help me reset. A coworker had told me about the place, said it was used for hunting trips sometimes, and that it wasn't fancy but it would keep the weather off my back. The drive out there took longer than I thought. The road wound through tall trees that blocked out much of the sky. The deeper I went, the less the air smelled of car exhaust and pavement, and the more it smelled of pine, damp soil, and old leaves. The cabin sat off a dirt track that was rough on my small car. Every bump made my tires crunch rocks and snap twigs under them, and when I finally pulled up to the clearing, the cabin looked almost hidden among the trees, like the woods were slowly swallowing it. It wasn't big, just a single-story wooden place with a tin roof, one door, and 2 windows in the front. The porch sagged a little, and the steps creaked when I tested them. There was no sign of recent use. No tire marks, no footprints, no chopped firewood stacked neatly like I expected from people who hunted there. Just weeds pushing up through the soil, branches scattered across the yard, and the faint smell of wet wood. Inside was simple. One room had a small table, 2 wooden chairs, and a counter with a rusty sink that I doubted worked. Against one wall was a cot with a thin mattress and a pile of wool blankets that smelled faintly of dust and mice. The other room was more of a storage space than anything. An old axe leaned in the corner, its blade dull, and some shelves lined with empty jars, rusted nails, and a coil of rope. I unloaded my bag, checked that I had everything I needed: food, water, flashlight, extra batteries, sleeping bag, a small first aid kit. I tried the sink just to see, but of course nothing came out. I had brought enough water jugs, so that was fine. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal on my small camp stove, listened to the silence outside, and lay down early. At first, the quiet was almost unbearable. I was so used to the hum of traffic, distant voices, the buzz of appliances. Here, the only sounds were the occasional groan of the cabin as it settled and the soft rustle of branches outside. I fell asleep later than I expected, but stayed asleep until morning. It was the second day when things started to feel different. I woke up before dawn, went outside to use the woods as a bathroom, and noticed something strange near the tree line. The dirt looked disturbed, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I crouched down and saw a line of scuff marks stretching from one side of the clearing to the other, vanishing into the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer had been wounded and had dragged itself through. That seemed believable, so I let it go. Most of the day I spent walking around, trying to get used to the area. The forest floor was soft and springy, covered with a thick layer of pine needles. Every step released a faint, sharp smell. The deeper I went, the less light came through, and the more I realized how easy it would be to get lost. The trees looked the same in every direction. No real landmarks, just trunks and shadows. I stayed close to the cabin. By the afternoon, clouds started to roll in. The air grew heavier, and the woods seemed darker even though it wasn't evening yet. I went back inside and cooked another small meal. That's when I noticed something I couldn't ignore. The door. I had left it shut when I went walking. I was sure of that, but when I returned, it was slightly open. Not wide, just a crack, enough for a sliver of light to cut through the dim cabin interior. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't latched it properly, that maybe the wind had pushed it open, but the air was still heavy before the storm. I walked inside slowly, scanning every corner. Nothing was moved. My bag was where I had left it, the blankets still on the cot, the shelves untouched. But something about it made me uneasy. I shut the door tight, checked the frame, and saw faint scratches around the latch. Not new, but not ancient either. That night, the storm broke. Rain hammered on the tin roof so loud it drowned out almost every other sound. Thunder rolled through the hills, deep and long. I tried to sleep but kept waking up, convinced I heard something between the thunderclaps. The storm made everything seem closer, like the forest had pressed right up against the walls. Around midnight, I got up to check the door again. It was still shut, but water was dripping through a small gap in the frame. I shoved one of my spare shirts into the crack to stop it. When I finally fell asleep again, I had strange dreams. I was running through the woods in the dark, branches clawing at my arms, the ground soft and uneven beneath me. I couldn't see where I was going, but I knew something was following me. Every time I glanced back, I saw only a darker shape among the darkness. I woke with my heart pounding, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. The storm had passed. The cabin was quiet again. On the third morning, I went outside to breathe fresh air and saw more signs that I wasn't alone. Near the edge of the clearing, by the trees, the soil was turned up again, only this time the marks were fresh, clear. A line of footprints, barefoot, heading toward the woods. The size of them made me freeze. They weren't small like a child's, but not wide like a big man's either. They were long, narrow, and pressed deep into the soil as if whoever left them had been carrying weight or moving fast. I counted 6 before they vanished into the pine needles where tracks became impossible to follow. I stood there a long time, scanning the tree line. The woods gave nothing back, just still trunks and scattered leaves. I couldn't hear birds either, which made it worse. I told myself maybe someone had used the cabin before me, maybe a hunter had come back. But why barefoot? Why leave tracks so close to where I was staying? I didn't like the idea of someone watching me, so I decided I'd cut my trip short. I packed most of my things during the day, stuffing everything back into my bag except the essentials I still needed for the night. My plan was to leave first thing in the morning, drive back to the main road, and head home. 3 nights would be enough. That evening, I sat by the window with my flashlight off, just listening. First, nothing. Then, as the woods darkened, I began to hear small snaps, faint cracks, like twigs underfoot. Always far off, never close, but enough to remind me the forest wasn't empty. Once, I thought I saw movement between 2 trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stayed awake longer than I wanted, my eyes fixed on the door. Sometime past midnight, I must have dozed off sitting in the chair, because I woke to a noise that was much closer. A soft scrape like wood against wood. I turned my head slowly toward the door. The latch was moving. Not fast, not loud, but shifting as if someone outside was pressing against it, testing it. My heart thudded in my ears. I sat frozen, barely breathing. The latch held, and after a few long seconds, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. When the first light touched the trees, I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The clearing looked empty, silent, but the dirt near the steps told me otherwise. Fresh footprints, the same narrow shape, pressed into the mud right up to the porch. They circled the cabin once, then vanished back into the woods. I didn't wait to think. I went straight to my car, shoved the bag inside, and started the engine. The tires spun in the wet soil before gripping, and I drove down the dirt track faster than I should have, branches scraping the sides of the car. Every curve felt like it was taking too long. Every shadow looked like movement. I didn't slow until I hit the paved road again, miles later. When I finally reached town, I pulled over at a gas station, hands shaking on the wheel. The morning sun was bright, normal life going on around me, people filling their tanks, a dog barking in the distance. It felt unreal compared to where I had just been. I never went back for the food and gear I had left behind in the cabin, and I never told anyone exactly what I saw. The tracks, the door latch, the scrape in the night, they were real. I don't know who was out there in those woods with me, or how long they had been watching, but I know if I had stayed one more night, the latch might not have held. I had been planning the cabin trip for months, mostly because I wanted some quiet time away from everything. My life in the city had been loud and restless for too long, and I needed a place where no one could bother me. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The listing said it was secluded, private, and rustic. That was exactly what I thought I needed, so I booked it for 2 weeks. I wanted silence, long walks in the forest, simple meals, and nights with nothing but the crackling of firewood. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The roads kept getting narrower and rougher, and the GPS on my phone stopped working about 10 miles before I reached the property. I had printed directions just in case, and I was glad I did because without them I never would have found the place. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, my shoulders were sore from gripping the steering wheel, and my eyes ached from the strain of watching every bend in the dirt road. The cabin looked smaller than the pictures, but it was sturdy. It sat on a clearing with tall trees all around, the kind of trees that blocked most of the sunlight even during the day. The wood was dark, weathered, and the roof had a layer of moss near the edges. There was a front porch with 2 old rocking chairs, and the windows had heavy shutters. It didn't look welcoming, but I didn't come for comfort. I came for quiet. Inside, the cabin was simple. One large room with a kitchen corner, a dining table, and a sitting area with a wood stove. In the back was a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser. The bathroom was cramped, with a rusty sink and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The smell inside was strong, a mix of old wood and something faintly metallic, like damp nails. I opened the windows to let some air in, but the forest outside was so thick that it felt like the air didn't move much. That first evening, I unloaded my car, stacked my groceries in the little pantry, and started a fire in the stove. The wood smoked at first, but then caught and burned well. I heated up a simple meal, sat by the window while I ate, and listened to the forest. First, it was exactly what I wanted. There was no traffic, no voices, no buzzing of electronics, just the sound of insects, the occasional call of a bird, and the faint creaking of trees moving in the wind. But as it grew darker, the mood of the place changed. The forest went quiet all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. It wasn't a gradual slowing down of sounds. It was sudden. One moment there were crickets, and the next there was silence. I sat still, fork halfway to my mouth, listening. The silence made me more aware of myself. I could hear my own breathing and the faint crack of the firewood. Every small sound inside the cabin seemed louder. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just not used to real silence. In the city, even at night, there's always a hum, always something going on. Out here, it was different. I cleaned up my dishes, checked the locks on the doors, and lay down in the bed with a lantern beside me. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up to sounds that I couldn't place. A soft crunch outside, like footsteps on leaves. A faint thud, like something hitting the wall of the cabin. Once, I swore I heard the sound of breathing near the window, but when I forced myself to look, the shutter was closed tight. The logical part of my brain kept saying it was animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. But the pattern of the sounds didn't feel like animals. It felt measured, like something that knew I was there. The next morning, I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. I wanted to see if maybe a tree branch had fallen against the wall or if there were tracks from animals. I found nothing obvious, just leaves scattered and damp ground. But then I noticed something near the edge of the porch. The dirt there had marks in it, shallow but clear enough that they stood out. They looked like footprints, not from boots but from bare feet. The size was odd too, not small, not large, but somewhere in between. What unsettled me most was how close they were to the cabin, as if someone had been standing right against it during the night. I crouched there for a long time, staring at them, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the shape was too clear to ignore. Someone had been there. I told myself maybe it was an old mark, maybe left by the owner or another guest. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that they hadn't been there when I first arrived. I spent most of that day hiking. I thought it would clear my head. The trails weren't marked, but I followed deer paths and kept my bearings by the sun. The forest was dense, with patches of thick undergrowth that made me move slowly. Every so often, I stopped and listened, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. Once or twice, I thought I did, faint and distant, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. By the time I got back, the sun was low, and I felt drained. I made another simple meal and tried to distract myself with a book. But when night fell again, the same feeling returned. The forest went quiet, and the cabin felt like it was holding its breath. This time, I stayed awake longer, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, a faint crunching outside, moving slowly around the cabin. I froze, every muscle tight. The sound circled, paused near the window, then moved again. I didn't move until it stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to check, I peeked through a crack in the shutter. The clearing was dark, but the moon gave enough light to see the outline of the trees. I didn't see anyone. Still, the sense that something had been there didn't leave me. The next morning, I checked again outside. More prints, this time clearer, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin and back again. Whoever it was had been walking barefoot in the forest. The thought made my stomach twist. Who would walk barefoot out there? And why circle my cabin at night? I thought about leaving. I could have packed up and driven back to town. But part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I had come out here for solitude, and I didn't want to run back at the first sign of trouble. I told myself I'd keep watch that night, stay awake, and if it happened again, I'd know for sure. That third night was the worst. I stayed by the window, lantern low, watching. The silence came, heavy and thick, pressing in from the forest. Hours passed, and then, just when my eyelids started to droop, I heard it. Slow, deliberate steps coming closer. I gripped the edge of the chair so hard my fingers hurt. The steps reached the porch and the boards creaked under the weight. I held my breath, waiting. There was a pause, then the faint scrape of something against the door. Not knocking, not pounding, just a light touch, like fingertips brushing the wood. I sat frozen, sweat running down my back. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Then the steps moved away, slow again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. When the sun finally came, I went outside with shaking legs. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a single footprint. Clear, sharp, pressed into the thin layer of dirt and dust on the wood. Barefoot again. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving them into bags without caring how they fit. I loaded the car, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was waiting. When I finally started the engine, the sound felt like a relief. The drive back down that narrow dirt road was tense. I kept expecting to see someone step out of the trees, barefoot, blocking my path. But no one came, mile after mile, until finally the trees thinned and the signal bars on my phone returned. Only then did I let out the breath I felt I'd been holding for days. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station. My hands were still shaking as I filled the tank. A man at the next pump glanced at me, then at the dirt on my car, but he didn't say anything. I didn't want him to. I just wanted to be away from there. That night, back in my apartment, I lay in bed and thought about it. The prints, the sounds, the way whoever it was circled the cabin, watching, waiting. I thought about how they never tried to break in, never tried to talk, never showed themselves fully, just watched. That was worse than anything else. Not knowing who it was or what they wanted. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask for a refund, didn't leave a review, didn't even tell the rental company. I wanted to cut myself off from the memory of it. But sometimes, late at night when my apartment is quiet, I think about the sound of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling in the dark. And I wonder if whoever was out there is still walking, still watching, waiting for the next cabin to sit quiet in the woods. I went up to the cabin in late October, right when the nights started to get colder and the days became shorter. The cabin was old, tucked away in the woods at the end of a narrow dirt road that most people wouldn't even notice if they weren't looking for it. I had been there a few times before, always by myself, and each time I told myself it would be the last. It was the kind of place that felt peaceful when the sun was out but took on a heavy, uneasy feeling once the dark settled in. The trees grew thick around it, cutting off almost all view of the sky, and the silence was the kind that pressed down on you until you noticed every tiny sound. Every creak, every branch snapping, every shift of the wind. The cabin had one small bedroom, a bathroom that barely worked, and a main room with a stove, a couch, and an old wooden table. The walls were made of rough logs that smelled faintly of damp wood and smoke, and the floors were uneven. The place was simple, almost too simple, but I went there because I needed the quiet. My head had been noisy for months, and the city never gave me the silence I wanted. I thought maybe a weekend out there, away from everything, would help clear things up. I arrived in the afternoon with a small bag of food, a flashlight, and a thermos of water. The road in was muddy from the recent rain, and I had to park a little way back and walk the rest of the distance with my things. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was already slipping lower, turning the sky orange and making the trees look darker than they really were. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the familiar damp chill. The air always held onto cold in there, like the logs never let the warmth stay for long. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, set some firewood by the stove, and sat down at the table with my thermos. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the distant rustle of branches swaying. I kept checking my phone even though I knew there wasn't any service. It was habit more than anything. After a while, I stopped and tried to let myself sink into the stillness. As the sun disappeared, the shadows outside the windows grew darker and darker until the forest was nothing but black shapes pressed against the glass. I lit a lantern, set it on the table, and listened to the stove pop and crackle. I remember thinking how the quiet felt almost too perfect, like something was waiting to break it. I brushed the thought away and tried to focus on the fire. Later that night, as I was lying on the couch wrapped in a blanket, I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost too faint to notice, but it was there. A crunch, like a footstep on leaves, close to the cabin. I froze, my ears straining. At first, I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a branch falling. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step, then another, each one spaced out, not the fast movement of an animal, but something heavy, something human. The blanket felt suddenly suffocating, and I pushed it aside. My heart had started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move for a while, just listening. The steps circled the cabin, crunching softly, then stopping, then starting again. I knew the nearest neighbor was miles away, and nobody ever came out here without a reason. That thought stuck in my head, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I sat there, staring at the door, trying to hear if whoever it was still out there. After what felt like an hour, though it was probably just a few minutes, the sound faded. I waited longer, every muscle tight, until I finally convinced myself it must have been nothing. Maybe an animal after all. I tried to lie back down, but I didn't close my eyes. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Eventually, the fire burned low, and the lantern dimmed, and I just sat there in the dark until exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, when the light came through the cracks in the shutters, I got up and went outside. The ground was damp, covered in fallen leaves, and I walked around the cabin slowly. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Footprints, not animal tracks. Clear, heavy footprints pressed into the mud, circling the cabin exactly the way I had heard them the night before. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and went in a slow loop, stopping sometimes near the windows. Whoever had been there had walked right up to the walls, right up to the glass, and stood there looking in. I felt a wave of cold run through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. The woods were quiet again, but now they felt different, heavier, watching. I didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but another part told me I was overreacting, that maybe it was just some hunter passing through. I tried to make myself believe that, but deep down, I knew it didn't feel right. Whoever it was had come close on purpose. They hadn't passed by. They had circled. They had watched. I spent most of the day restless, unable to relax. I kept checking the windows, kept listening for movement outside. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I thought it was footsteps. I tried chopping some firewood to distract myself, but every crack of the axe made me feel more exposed. The woods around the cabin were dense, and I couldn't see more than a few dozen feet into them. Anything could be standing out there, just beyond my sight, and I would never know. That night, I tried to be ready. I stacked some wood by the stove, kept the lantern full, and even set a heavy iron poker beside the couch. I told myself it was just in case, though I didn't know what I thought I could really do with it. As the dark came down, the uneasiness grew heavier. I kept waiting for the sound to come back. For a long time, it didn't. The fire burned, the cabin creaked, and I almost thought maybe it had been a one-time thing. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same slow crunch of leaves. One step, then another. My skin went cold. The steps moved closer, circling again, and then I heard the faint sound of something brushing against the wall, like fingers dragging along the logs. I gripped the poker so tightly my hand ached. The lantern light threw shadows across the room, and every one of them seemed like it was shifting. I sat there, frozen, waiting, listening. This time, the steps stopped at the window. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, so soft I thought at first I was imagining it. Someone was standing just outside the glass, inches from where I sat, separated from me by nothing but the thin wall. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The fire popped loudly, and for a second I thought whoever it was would push through the window, but the sound faded again. After a long time, the steps moved away into the trees, and the silence returned. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, staring at the door until the sun came back up. When it did, I checked again, and the footprints were there, fresh ones, clearer this time. They went right up to the window, pressed deep into the mud, facing straight toward the glass. I felt sick looking at them. Someone had been there again, closer than before, watching me through the night. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The silence that had once felt calming was now suffocating, and every tree outside felt like it was hiding someone behind it. I packed my bag quickly, hardly even thinking, and stepped outside. The woods were still, but I felt eyes on me the entire time. As I walked toward my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. The dirt road was narrow, lined with trees so close they blocked the light, and every shadow made me tense. When I finally saw my car, I felt relief, but it was short-lived. My stomach sank when I noticed the driver's side door. It was slightly open. I knew I had locked it when I left it. I froze in the road, staring. The mud around the car was disturbed, footprints leading up to the door. My bag of food that I had left inside was gone. Wrappers scattered on the ground nearby. Someone had been in my car, had gone through my things, and had been waiting nearby the whole time. I didn't stop to think. I ran the rest of the way, threw my bag into the back, and climbed in. The inside smelled faintly of damp leaves and sweat. Not mine. I started the engine and pulled away so fast the car fishtailed in the mud. My hands were shaking the whole time, my eyes darting to the mirrors, certain I would see someone stepping out of the trees. But the road stayed empty, the woods silent. I didn't slow down until I reached the paved road miles away. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, kept expecting headlights behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out in front of me. The whole drive back, the thought pressed heavier and heavier. Whoever it was had known I was there, had come close enough to watch me, had opened my car, had eaten my food, had stood outside the cabin in the dark while I sat inside, powerless. And if I had stayed another night, I didn't know what would have happened. By the time I got back to the city, the relief of being around people again was so strong I almost couldn't believe I had wanted silence in the first place. The cabin that once felt like a retreat now felt poisoned, unsafe. I never went back after that. The ending was clear enough to me. Someone had been out there in those woods, not lost, not passing by, but waiting, watching, testing how close they could. It was late autumn when I decided to take a trip into the woods. I had been feeling worn down from my daily routine and needed a place where I could shut everything out. I had always found a kind of peace in being away from people, where the only sounds I could hear were the wind moving through the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. A friend had once mentioned a small rental cabin tucked deep into a stretch of forest, far from main roads and without much around it. It sounded perfect. I wanted to be alone, far away and quiet. That is what drew me to it. The drive out was long, nearly 4 hours from the city, and most of it was on narrow back roads that twisted through farmland and then climbed into wooded hills. The pavement ended about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin, and I had to follow a dirt road that narrowed so much that tree branches scraped the sides of my truck. I kept thinking how hard it would be for anyone else to find this place. That thought comforted me at first, though later it would feel different. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, a dull orange glow sitting between the trees. The cabin looked exactly as I had imagined. One story, built from rough logs, with a small porch and a single window looking out over the clearing. There was a fire pit a few yards away, surrounded by damp leaves and moss-covered stones. The place looked weathered but still strong, the kind of structure that had been there for decades. There were no other houses, no barns, nothing. Just trees on every side. I stepped out of my truck and stood for a while, listening. The air was still and heavy. The forest seemed quiet, almost too quiet. There were no cars in the distance, no dogs barking, no voices. Just an occasional crack of a branch somewhere far back in the woods. I carried my bags inside and shut the door behind me. The door felt heavy, the wood swollen from years of damp weather. Inside, the cabin was small but enough. There was a single bed pushed against the wall, a wood stove for heat, a small table with 2 chairs, and a counter with some old kitchen items. A narrow hallway led to a small bathroom. The floor creaked when I walked across it, and everything smelled faintly of wood smoke and dampness. I set my things down and lit a lantern since the daylight was fading quickly. First, the evening felt calm. I unpacked, made myself a simple meal, and sat on the porch with a blanket around me. The woods turned darker and darker until they were nothing but shapes. I could hear small animals moving in the leaves and the distant sound of an owl. I thought about how alone I really was, and for some reason, that thought was both soothing and slightly unsettling. The kind of quiet that can feel safe at first but also makes you aware that if something happened, no one would hear you. When I finally went inside, I locked the door, even though I doubted anyone else was out here. Still, it felt like the right thing to do. I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the cabin settling, the faint sound of wind brushing against the roof, and eventually I drifted into sleep. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was sharp and distinct, not like the natural groans of the cabin. It sounded like something outside, something heavy snapping a branch close to the cabin. I froze in bed, listening, my heart beginning to race. I waited for it to repeat, but after a long silence, I convinced myself it was just an animal. Deer were common out here, maybe even a bear. I tried to relax again, though sleep came slowly after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The air was cold and damp. I noticed broken twigs near the edge of the clearing, not far from the porch. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I realized they looked freshly snapped, not something that had been lying around for days. Something heavy had passed through here last night, and it had been close. I told myself again that it was just wildlife. Still, I felt uneasy as I walked back inside. During the day, I busied myself with small tasks. I gathered wood for the stove, swept the floor, and even walked a short trail I found behind the cabin. The forest was thick and uneven, filled with undergrowth that grabbed at my clothes. The silence weighed on me the farther I went, and after a while I turned back. I didn't like the feeling of not knowing what was out there, of not being able to see more than a few yards ahead through the trees. That second night, I tried to stay calm. I lit a small fire in the stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat reading for a while. The silence grew heavier again as the hours passed. When I finally went to bed, I made sure the door was locked tight. It was past midnight when I woke again. This time, the sound was different. It was not just a branch. It was the sound of something brushing against the cabin itself. A scraping noise, slow and deliberate, like something dragging along the wall outside. My body tensed immediately. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, moving along the side of the cabin toward the window. I stayed still, my eyes on the dark ceiling above me, every muscle tight. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so deep it pressed into my ears. I didn't move until the first gray light of morning seeped through the window. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt sharp and cold. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the ground. Near the window, I saw marks in the dirt. They weren't paw prints, not the rounded shapes of animals. They looked like shoe prints, faint but clear enough. Someone had been standing close to the cabin during the night. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The woods that had seemed so peaceful now felt different, darker, almost watchful. I knew then that I wasn't alone out here. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every sound made me look over my shoulder. I checked the lock on the door several times. I thought about leaving, but the road was long and rough, and I didn't want to admit to myself that I was already afraid after only 2 nights. I told myself maybe it was an old footprint, Maybe someone had been here before me, but I knew the truth. Those prints hadn't been there the first day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the lantern low, listening to every noise outside. For hours, nothing happened. Then, deep into the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, not close at first, but steady, moving through the leaves, circling. My chest tightened as I realized someone was walking around the cabin. They stopped, then moved again. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the shifting of weight. Whoever it was, they were not trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear. I stayed frozen in bed, the blanket pulled tight around me, my ears straining. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then silence. Long, heavy silence. I imagined someone standing just feet from the door, waiting. When morning came, I was exhausted. My hands shook as I made coffee on the stove. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving away. But part of me still tried to push it down, to tell myself I was imagining things. When I stepped outside, I looked toward the clearing and froze. In the dirt, right at the edge of the porch, was a footprint. Clear, fresh, the tread of a boot pressed into the damp ground. It hadn't been there yesterday. My stomach turned as I realized it had been left during the night. I didn't want to stay anymore, but the day was half gone by the time I gathered my things and put them in the truck. I decided I would leave in the morning, when there was enough daylight to make the long drive safely. That night, I sat awake, the lantern burning low, a knife in my hand. I could hear the forest outside, but I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Every sound felt louder, closer. Then, near midnight, came the slow creak of the porch boards. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Someone was out there, standing just beyond the door. I gripped the knife tighter, barely breathing. The sound of footsteps moved back and forth on the porch, slow and heavy, then stopped right in front of the door. I sat frozen, waiting, every second stretched into forever. The doorknob rattled softly, then harder. Someone was trying it, testing it. The lock held. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight finally came, I grabbed my bags, rushed to the truck, and started the engine. I didn't even look back at the cabin. As I drove down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the truck, I felt my chest loosen just slightly. But even miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me from the trees. Someone who had been out there for nights, circling, waiting, trying the door. I never went back to that cabin again. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of town, far from the constant ring of my phone and the pressure of people around me. The cabin had been sitting empty for years, owned by a distant relative who let me use it without much thought. It wasn't big, just a square wooden building with one main room, a small kitchen corner, a bathroom that barely worked, and a sleeping loft with a thin mattress and a small window looking out over the trees. The place had a roof that sagged in the middle, walls that smelled like old pine, and floors that creaked whenever I shifted my weight. It wasn't comfortable in the modern sense, but I didn't mind. I wanted quiet, and this was quiet. The first few days passed slowly. I filled the time with chopping wood, boiling water, and reading books I had brought with me. The cabin didn't have electricity, so when the sun went down, I relied on a lantern and a few candles. At first, that rhythm felt strange, but I grew used to it. There was something grounding about watching the light fade in the trees, knowing the day was ending, and having no screen or machine to keep me awake except the dim glow of a flame. I ate simple food, canned beans and rice, things I had packed into boxes before I drove out here. It wasn't about comfort, it was about being away. The woods around the cabin stretched for miles. The trees were tall, thick, and close together, so dense that even during the day it sometimes felt darker than it should have been. The trails weren't marked, and the ground was covered in layers of pine needles and dead leaves that muffled sound. When I walked out there, I noticed how quickly I lost track of direction. Everything looked the same trunks, the same tangled branches, the same soft earth underfoot. I carried a compass and made sure I didn't wander too far, but the feeling of being swallowed by endless trees stayed with me. At night, the forest changed. The air got cooler, sharper. I could hear small movements outside the cabin walls, branches breaking, leaves shifting. I told myself it was deer or raccoons or maybe a fox, but the sound still made me pause sometimes, holding my breath and listening. Out here, even small sounds carried a weight. By the fourth day, I had slipped into a routine. I woke up with the sun, made coffee on the small gas burner I had brought, walked a little into the woods, then spent the afternoon writing notes in a notebook or sitting quietly. It was working the way I wanted. It was stripping things down, giving me quiet, even if that quiet sometimes pressed down too heavy. I had started to notice things though, things that weren't dramatic at first, but they stuck in my mind longer than they should have. It started with the footprints. I had been walking down toward the creek a short distance from the cabin. The ground near the creek stayed damp, and the mud held marks longer than the dry ground around the trees. That day, when I came down the slope, I saw prints in the mud that didn't belong to me. They weren't boot prints like mine, and they weren't animal either. They looked like the bottom of shoes, regular shoes, thin soles. The shape was too narrow to be mine, and the tread didn't match. They led down toward the water, then stopped at the edge. I stood there a long time, staring at them, thinking maybe I had missed them on an earlier walk. Maybe they were old, but they didn't look washed out by rain or time. They looked sharp, new. The mud still held the edges. I walked around, scanning the ground, trying to see if they came from the other side of the creek, but I didn't see anything. Just those few prints leading down and stopping at the water. I tried to brush it off. Could have been someone passing through, maybe a hunter or a hiker. People could come through these woods, even if it felt like the middle of nowhere. I didn't like the idea of someone being close, but it wasn't impossible. Still, it stuck in my head. I found myself thinking about them as I sat in the cabin that night, lantern light flickering on the walls, listening to the forest shift. When I lay down on the mattress in the loft, I thought I heard movement outside, just faint crunches in the leaves. I told myself it was animals again, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I decided to check again. I went down to the creek. The prints were still there, and this time there were more. A set parallel to the first, fresher, pressed deep into the mud, leading away from the water and back into the woods. I knelt down and studied them. They weren't mine. I knew what my boots looked like. These were flat, shallow-soled, like sneakers. The size looked smaller than mine, maybe by a couple of inches. I followed them a short way, but the ground quickly turned to leaves and pine needles, and the shapes vanished. I stood still, listening, staring into the trees, but the woods were silent. The thought of someone being out here without me knowing sat heavy in my stomach. If it was just another person, fine, but why so close to the cabin? Why in the middle of the night? I tried not to think about it, but my eyes kept drifting toward the tree line as I chopped wood or carried water. The silence didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't calming now. It was tense, heavy, as if something waited inside it. That night was worse. I had gone to bed early, but I woke up in the dark. The cabin was silent at first, then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, steady, leaves shifting under weight. They weren't close to the door, but they circled, moving around the cabin. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I lay still, my ears straining. The steps paused, then continued, as if someone was walking a slow circle. After what felt like forever, the sound faded into the woods again. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up with the lantern burning low, staring at the window, waiting for morning. When daylight came, I went out to check. Around the cabin, in the dirt and needles, I saw them, prints, not animal. Shoes. They circled the cabin just as I had heard. My skin crawled as I studied them. Someone had been out there, circling in the dark, close enough to touch the walls. I checked the door, the window latches. Nothing was broken, nothing forced. Whoever it was hadn't tried to get in. They had just walked, slow and deliberate, around me as I lay inside. The rest of the day, I couldn't sit still. I kept glancing into the woods, expecting movement. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me resisted. I didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself I could handle it, that it might have been some drifter passing through, curious, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel that simple. This felt like someone watching, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair by the window, lantern off, listening. Hours passed in silence. Then sometime near midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. They came from the trees, slow, measured, circling once more. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I had brought in from the woodpile, my heart hammering. I thought about stepping outside, confronting whoever it was, but fear pinned me in place. I stayed still, breathing shallow, listening as the steps made their way around the cabin, then faded back into the woods again. By morning, I had made my decision. I couldn't stay here. This wasn't peace anymore. This was something else, something dangerous. I packed my things quickly, stuffing food and clothes back into bags, loading them into my car. When I went around to the other side of the cabin, I froze. In the dirt right against the wall was something new. A single shoe print, pressed sharp and clear, facing the window of the loft where I slept. Whoever it was had stood there, looking up at me while I lay in the dark. I didn't wait any longer. I got in the car and drove, the gravel road twisting through the trees, my eyes flicking to the mirrors again and again. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until I reached the highway and saw other cars, other people. Only then did I feel my shoulders start to drop, though the unease never fully left. Whoever had been out there hadn't broken in, hadn't spoken, hadn't touched me, but the silence of what they did, the circling, the watching, felt heavier than anything else could have. It wasn't random. It wasn't chance. It was deliberate. And I knew I would never forget the sound of those footsteps in the leaves outside the cabin, slow and steady, circling me in the dark. I drove deeper into the back roads than I should have, further than I had planned. I kept watching the fuel gauge drop a little lower than I liked, and the turns in the road began to feel endless. The cabin I had rented was marked as remote in the listing, but remote can mean many things. I didn't think it would mean that I would lose phone service nearly an hour before even getting there. The sun was dropping, and the trees on both sides of the road pressed in closer, the light between them thinning as if the woods themselves were swallowing it. By the time I pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, I was already uneasy. The place looked older than in the pictures. The logs were dark from years of rain and rot at the edges. The roof sagged a little on one side. The windows were small, with heavy shutters closed over them like eyes that didn't want to open. The dirt clearing was silent. No cars, no tire tracks, no footprints, just dry leaves piled against the porch steps. Felt like no one had stayed here for a long time. I turned off the engine and sat for a minute, the ticking of the hot metal cooling in the still air the only sound. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. When I finally stepped out, the smell of damp earth and pine was heavy. There was no wind. The cabin stood there waiting, and I forced myself to carry my bags up the steps. Inside, the air was musty. It smelled like wood that had been closed off too long, mixed with old smoke from the stone fireplace in the center of the main room. Dust floated in the slanting light that came through the one uncovered window. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a table, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow bed pushed against one wall, and shelves with a few pots and pans. The kind of setup meant for short stays, not for comfort. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked the rooms. There were only 2. The main room and a small side room with nothing but a rickety dresser and a window that looked straight into the trees. That was all. I checked the front door. The lock was just a simple slide bolt. Not strong. The back door, if you could call it that, was even worse, just a piece of warped wood with a hook to keep it closed. My stomach tightened a little at the thought of being here alone with only those thin barriers between me and the outside. I told myself it was fine, it was just for a few nights. But the unease settled in anyway. That first night, I lit the small lantern provided in the cabin and sat at the table. The woods outside turned black quickly, so dark it was like the trees had erased everything beyond the porch. The silence was deep. Every so often, I thought I heard something, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But when I stopped breathing to listen harder, there was nothing. I ate a small meal from the cooler I brought, bread and cheese, then tried to distract myself with a book. but my eyes kept going back to the window. The glass was thin, and outside that window was just a wall of black. By the time I went to bed, I was already restless. The mattress sagged in the middle, and every shift made the springs groan. I lay there in the dark, the lantern off, the only sound my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard it, soft but sharp enough to slice through the silence. A crunch outside, like a boot on dry leaves. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe. Then I heard it again, slower this time, as if someone was stepping with care. My mouth went dry. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the sound came again, closer now, and I couldn't shake the picture of someone standing just beyond the window, staring in. I didn't move. I lay still for what felt like hours, listening. The sound came and went, then faded into nothing. I eventually fell into a shallow sleep, though every creak of the cabin woke me again. The next morning, the world looked harmless again. Light poured through the trees, birds moved through the branches, and the clearing seemed calm. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw it. In the soft dirt at the edge of the clearing, near the tree line, there were footprints. Human. They weren't mine. The tread of a heavy boot, pressed deep into the ground, pointing toward the cabin. I stood there staring at them, my chest tightening, the woods suddenly looking far less friendly. Whoever it was had been here last night. Watching, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was an old footprint. Maybe a hunter had passed through days ago. But the edges were sharp, the ground around them undisturbed, no leaves blown in. They were fresh. I backed away, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone still there. But there was nothing. The day dragged on. I couldn't shake the thought of the prints. I tried to busy myself, cleaned out the fireplace, boiled water for coffee, walked a little down the dirt road. But every time I looked back at the cabin, it felt wrong. Like I was being watched. The woods were too quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but waiting. That night was worse. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Around midnight, I heard the sounds again. This time slower, more deliberate, the leaves crunching softly, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I sat up in bed, my chest pounding. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there in the dark, straining to hear. The steps circled, then stopped near the back door. I waited, breath shallow, until finally there was a sound that made my stomach drop, the faint scrape of the hook lifting. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the lantern, lighting it with shaking hands. The hook was still in place. The door was closed, but I knew what I had heard. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting at the table with the lantern burning low, staring at that door. The morning came slow. I stepped outside again, and sure enough, the dirt told the truth. More prints, fresh, this time circling the cabin. Whoever it was had walked the perimeter close enough to touch the walls. My throat went dry. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was coming here at night, watching, maybe testing the doors. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving out. But the road was long, fuel was low, and part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was someone curious, a local, a hunter. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Hunters don't walk slow circles around cabins at midnight. Hunters don't test doors. The third night broke me. It started the same, the crunch of steps, the pause, the long silence. Then a new sound. A slow drag along the wall, like fingers or something scraping the wood. It went from one side of the cabin to the other, unhurried, deliberate. I sat frozen, lantern off, the dark pressing in. Then came the knock, soft on the window nearest the bed. Just 2 taps, but enough to make every muscle in me lock tight. I stayed awake until morning again, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on that window. When light finally came, I stepped outside. The glass had a smudge on it, low down, like the mark of a hand pressed flat against it. That was it. I couldn't stay another night. I gathered my things, loaded the car, and didn't even stop to eat. As I pulled out of the clearing, I looked once in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there in the morning sun, silent and empty again, but I knew it wasn't. Someone had been there, someone who would probably keep coming back. By the time I made it to the main road, my hands had stopped shaking, but the memory stayed. The sound of the steps, the knock on the window, the smudge of the handprint. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. It was someone who wanted me to know they were there. Someone who liked circling cabins in the dark. I never went back. I never even contacted the owner to explain. Some things you don't explain. You just leave behind and try to forget. But every so often, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I hear it again. That slow crunch of footsteps outside, circling, waiting, testing. I drove deeper into the woods that afternoon, following the narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees and climbed slowly toward the ridge. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the uneven track, and the silence in those woods pressed down heavier the farther I went. I had rented a small cabin for a week. It was supposed to be a place to be alone, away from noise, away from people, away from everything. The listing had shown a wooden cabin on a slope with nothing around it except forest. It looked like the perfect place to switch off. I had pictured mornings of coffee on the porch, afternoons of walking through the trees, evenings by a fire. That was what I expected. But things never go the way you think they will when you're out in places where nobody can hear you and nobody is close enough to care. By the time I reached the turnoff where the road ended, my car tires crunched into gravel and I saw the cabin through the trees. It sat on a flat patch of ground cut into the slope, with the woods rising steeply behind it and falling away into the valley below. The cabin was smaller than the pictures had made it look. One story, a slanted roof, the kind of porch where the wood always looks gray from rain and sun. There was a stack of firewood on one side and an old metal trash can near the corner. The windows were dark, reflecting the late afternoon light, and the place looked like it had been waiting for years without anyone inside. I parked in front and shut the car off. The silence hit harder once the engine stopped. The forest wasn't alive with sound like I had thought it would be. There were no birds calling, no wind in the branches, just stillness. I carried my bags to the porch and unlocked the front door with the key that had been mailed to me. The wood creaked as I stepped in. The air inside was stale, smelling of old smoke and dust. The place had the bare minimum. A couch against one wall, a small table, a fireplace, a counter with a stove, a fridge that hummed loudly when I plugged it in. Down a narrow hallway, there was one small bedroom and a bathroom. Nothing more. It was enough, I told myself, and I liked the quiet. That first evening, I set my bags down, unpacked a little, and lit a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound filled the cabin and made the silence outside feel less heavy. I cooked a simple meal, sat on the couch, and let the firelight flicker across the walls. For a while it felt right, almost peaceful. When night came, though, the silence outside turned different. The windows reflected only the inside of the room, and the woods beyond were pitch black. I stepped out on the porch once, just to take in the night air, but the darkness was complete, like walking into a wall. I stayed only a minute before going back inside and locking the door. That first night, I slept fine, but I woke up once to a sound. It was faint, like a crunch of leaves outside, but then nothing followed. I stayed still in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The silence after was too thick. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer passing by, and I forced myself back to sleep. In the morning, I forgot about it. The second day, I tried to explore. The woods were dense, and the ground sloped in all directions. It was easy to lose sight of the cabin after only a few minutes of walking. I followed a game trail downhill, careful to keep track of where I had come from, and reached a small clearing where the ground was damp and covered in moss. I saw tracks in the mud, large ones, maybe a deer or elk. I crouched down and looked closer, noticing that some of them were fresher than others. The forest felt closed in around me, and when the wind moved through the trees, it was the first time I had actually heard sound out there. I stayed a while, then went back up to the cabin. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with coffee. The sun was bright, but the cabin sat in partial shade under the tall trees. The stillness was heavy again. I watched the woods, my eyes tracing the trunks and the thick undergrowth, always expecting to see something move. Nothing did. The quiet was unnatural. I had grown up in places where the woods were alive with sound, and I kept noticing the lack of it here. I told myself it was just the season, or maybe I wasn't listening right. But the longer I sat, the more it pressed in. That night, things changed. After I ate and sat by the fire for a while, I went to bed. I woke around midnight to a sound outside. This time, it wasn't just one crunch. It was slower, heavier, like deliberate steps on the ground. My body froze, listening. The sound came from one side of the cabin, near the porch. The steps stopped. Then there was nothing. My heart pounded as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again, waiting for more. After a few minutes, I heard the faintest creak, like wood shifting. It sounded like the porch boards under weight. Then silence again. I didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, barely breathing, until the first faint light of morning showed at the window. Only then did I sit up and look around. Nothing was out of place inside, but I didn't check outside right away. I sat at the table, staring at the door, not wanting to open it. Eventually, I forced myself to go out. The porch looked normal. The dirt around it didn't show much, but near the steps I thought I saw an impression, maybe a shoe print. It was faint, almost washed out. I stared at it for a long time, then went back inside. The whole day I felt on edge, couldn't relax. I tried to read, tried to walk in the woods again, but every sound, every shift of light between the trees made me turn my head. I found myself looking back at the cabin from the trees often, making sure it was still there, making sure nothing was moving around it. I didn't go far. I kept the building in sight at all times. When night came, I dreaded it. That second night, I barely slept. I lay in bed with the blankets pulled up, staring toward the window where the black pressed in. For hours, there was nothing. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard the crunch again. This time, it circled. Slow steps around the cabin, pausing, then moving again. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't passing by. They were moving around the cabin, staying close. I kept expecting a knock at the wall or a shadow in the window, but it never came. Just the steps, then silence. The silence was worse because it meant I couldn't tell if they were gone or waiting. I stayed awake until dawn again, and when the light finally came, I felt like my body had been wrung out. I was shaking, exhausted, but afraid to even step outside. When I did, I looked around carefully. Again, there were faint marks in the dirt, too large and too even to be animal. I followed them a little way into the trees, but they disappeared in the undergrowth. Whoever had been there knew how to move quietly. I thought about leaving that day, but the road back was long, and part of me told myself I was just imagining, that maybe the sounds had been animals. I wanted to believe it. I stayed. The third day dragged. I tried to keep busy, chopping some of the firewood, cleaning inside, cooking, but everything I did felt like waiting for night. When it came, I was already tense, sitting by the fire with my ears straining. The hours went slow. Then the sound started again. This time there was no doubt. The steps came to the porch, and I heard the wood creak, long and slow. Then it stopped. For a full hour there was nothing. Then a light tapping at the wall. Soft, almost gentle, but real. My throat went dry. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at the door, every muscle ready to snap. The tapping stopped, and after another long silence, I heard the crunch of retreating steps, fading into the woods. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back to the wall, staring at the door, gripping a heavy piece of wood from the firewood stack like a weapon. When morning came, I felt like I had been awake for days. My thoughts were blurry, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags quickly, stuffing everything into them without care. I carried them to the car, loaded up, and started down the dirt road as fast as the car would let me go. The woods pressed in, the trees seemed endless, and every turn felt like it stretched longer than it should. But finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the paved road ahead. Only then did my chest loosen a little. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove until I saw other cars, other people. The silence of the woods stayed with me, though, pressing at the back of my mind. Someone had been there those nights. Not an animal, not my imagination. Someone who knew how to move quietly, how to wait, how to circle in the dark. I thought about the faint shoe prints, the tapping at the wall, the hours of silence where they stood just outside. If I had stayed one more night, if I had opened the door at the wrong time, if I had made a sound when they were close, I don't know what would have happened. All I know is that I left before I found out, and I never went back. I had gone up to the mountains to get away from everything. My plan was simple. I rented a small cabin that sat far back on a dirt road, tucked between heavy woods and not close to any neighbors. The listing had mentioned that the nearest store was about 20 minutes down the road, and even that was small, just a local place that sold groceries, hardware, and basic supplies. I wanted quiet and I wanted time to think, and the place seemed like it would give me both. When I pulled up the first afternoon, the place felt older than the photos made it look. The wood siding was dark and weathered. The roof was metal and dented from years of hail and snow. There was a porch that wrapped halfway around the front, with 2 broken rocking chairs sitting against the railing. The inside smelled of pine and damp earth. Not bad, just strong. The windows were small, and the whole cabin was dim, even in the middle of the day. The first hours passed quietly. I unpacked my food, put some bottled water on the counter, and stacked my clothes in the small bedroom that had only a bed, a nightstand, and a metal lamp. There was no cell signal out there, which I had known before coming, but the silence of it hit me stronger once I realized I couldn't even open my phone to check the time without seeing the blank bars. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of soup on the propane stove, read an old paperback I had brought, and went to sleep early. The cabin creaked at night, and I heard the sounds of animals moving in the woods, but nothing bothered me. It was the second night when things began to shift. I had been outside that evening, sitting on the porch while the sun went down. The trees made the light fade faster than it did in the open, and within a few minutes the woods were dark. As I sat there, I caught a sound that didn't fit with the others. At first, I thought it was another animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush, but then it came again, slower, heavier. It sounded like careful footsteps. The sound stopped before I could be sure. I sat still on the porch, trying to listen past the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. For a long time, nothing happened. Eventually, I went inside, closed the door, and locked it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the wood made me sit up and listen. My mind kept going back to that sound, the way it didn't match the random movements of animals. It had sounded deliberate, like someone stepping on leaves and then stopping when they knew they were being heard. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was thick with pine needles, leaves, and soft dirt, and I wasn't sure I would see anything even if someone had been there. But as I made my way around the back, I noticed a set of scuffed marks in the dirt near the trees. They were faint, but they looked like the outline of a boot sole. It unsettled me, but I told myself it could have been from the owner or someone doing maintenance earlier in the season. I tried to shake it off and spent the day hiking a short trail I had seen down the road. By the time I got back, I was tired enough that I didn't think much about it anymore. But that night, it happened again. I had just turned off the lamp and was lying in bed when I heard it. Slow steps outside the cabin, moving across the porch this time. The wood creaked under the weight. My chest went tight, and I held my breath. The steps moved closer to the door and stopped. I stared at the door in the dark, the faint outline barely visible against the dim window. I could hear the soft sound of someone shifting their weight, like they were standing just inches from the door. I didn't move. I stayed frozen in bed, listening, waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound of the weight on the porch eased, and the steps moved away, back across the boards and then down onto the ground. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint rustling, but I couldn't tell if it was a person or just the woods. The next morning, I checked again. On the porch, I found it clear as day. Dirt smudges shaped like the tread of boots. They hadn't been there the day before. That's when I realized someone had been watching the cabin. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me felt like maybe I was overreacting. I told myself it could have been a hunter or a hiker who had gotten curious. But the marks were right up against the door. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time. The third night was worse. I tried to prepare. Before dark, I closed all the blinds, locked the door, and checked the windows. I sat with my back against the wall in the main room, the lamp off, the only light coming from the thin glow of the moon through the curtains. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin this time, moving across the dirt, stopping, then starting again. My heart hammered so loud I thought whoever was outside would hear it. At one point, the steps stopped right under the bedroom window. The sound of breathing came next, faint but real, just inches from where I had slept the night before. I stayed in the main room, not daring to move. After a long stretch, the steps faded again back into the woods. The next day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend another night like that. I started packing, throwing my clothes and food back into the bags. I had just finished when I heard the sound of an engine on the dirt road. It was the first car I had heard since arriving. I stepped onto the porch and saw an old truck roll up. The man driving looked rough, with a beard down to his chest and a faded cap pulled low. He slowed near the cabin but didn't wave. He just looked at me, his face blank, before driving on down the road. I don't know why, but the look he gave me chilled me more than anything I had felt yet. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't friendliness. It was something cold, something that said I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I didn't leave like I had planned. I kept thinking about driving the road alone in the dark, not knowing if that truck might be waiting somewhere down the line. I decided to stay until morning, but night brought worse. The steps came back, this time more than one set. I could hear them clearly, 2, maybe 3 people moving around the cabin. They whispered low, too soft to make out words, but I knew it wasn't animals. At one point, something scraped along the siding, slow and sharp, like a knife dragging against the wood. I sat in the dark, clutching the heavy flashlight I had brought, wishing I had something more to defend myself with. They stayed longer this time, hours, moving, stopping, circling. I didn't sleep at all. When dawn came, they were gone. But outside the cabin, I found what they had left. Against the porch railing, a strip of torn fabric hung, like it had been cut from clothing. In the dirt, multiple boot prints overlapped, some small, some larger. That was enough. I packed as fast as I could, loaded my car, and started down the road. Every turn of the dirt path felt like it could reveal that truck. My hands shook on the wheel the whole way out. When I finally reached the small town, I pulled into the store and went inside. The woman at the counter looked at me strangely, probably because I was pale and sweating. I asked about the cabin, about whether people came around up there often. She hesitated, then said that most folks stayed away from that area. She didn't explain why, but the look in her eyes told me it wasn't just about the rough road. I didn't go back. I left the key in the drop box and drove straight home. For weeks after, I woke at night to the memory of those footsteps, that slow breathing just outside the thin wall. And the worst part wasn't knowing they had been there. The worst part was knowing they had never tried to break in. They didn't want my things. They wanted me to know they were out there, watching, waiting. I never went back to a cabin again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a chance to get away from everything, a break from the noise of the city and the endless routine that seemed to weigh me down more with each passing day. I rented a small cabin in the woods, the kind of place you see in pictures where the trees stretch tall and heavy around it, where the air is supposed to be cleaner, where time moves slower. I thought it would be peaceful, a quiet spot where I could clear my head. The drive out was long, and the farther I got from the main road, the less comfortable I felt. At first, the roads were paved, smooth and familiar, but soon enough they turned into narrow gravel paths that twisted through thick woods. My car jolted with every bump, and the forest seemed to close in tighter around me with each mile. The trees pressed in so close to the road that in some places I felt like the branches might scrape the sides of the car. There was no cell service. I checked my phone several times, hoping for even a single bar, but there was nothing. It felt like I had already cut myself off from the rest of the world before I even reached the cabin. When I finally pulled up, the place looked smaller than the photos I had seen online. The wood was darker, weathered from years of storms, and the roof sagged slightly near the back. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't as welcoming as I had expected either. Still, it was mine for the week, and I reminded myself that the whole point of being there was to be alone, away from everything. Inside, it was simple. A single room with a bed against one wall, a small kitchen area with an old stove, a wood-burning heater in the corner, and a bathroom off to the side. The windows were narrow and streaked with dust. The silence was the first thing that struck me. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Just silence and the faint rustling of trees outside. At first, it was almost comforting, but there was something heavy about it too, like the quiet was too thick, like it pressed in on me. I unloaded my bag, set it on the bed, and walked around to get a sense of the place. The back door opened to a small deck that looked out into the woods. The trees stood close together, their branches bare this time of year, the ground littered with fallen leaves. The forest seemed endless, stretching in every direction with no sign of another cabin or road. Standing there, I felt truly cut off. The first night passed uneventfully. I made myself a simple meal, sat by the heater, and tried to read, but I kept catching myself listening instead. Listening for something. I wasn't sure what. The cabin creaked now and then as the wind pushed against it, and the trees outside groaned as their branches scraped against each other. I told myself it was normal, but each sound made me glance toward the window. When I finally crawled into bed, it took a long time for sleep to come. The second day, I tried to settle in. I went for a walk along a narrow path behind the cabin, crunching over dead leaves, watching the way the light filtered through the branches. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. For a moment, I thought maybe I could enjoy this after all. But as I walked, I started to feel uneasy. The path didn't seem to lead anywhere. I walked longer than I meant to, and each step seemed to take me deeper into a maze of trees. When I finally turned around, I had the unsettling feeling that I had been watched the entire time. There was nothing behind me but woods, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, my stomach tightening each time. By the time I saw the cabin again through the trees, I felt oddly relieved, like I had escaped something. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sat on the deck for a while, staring out at the dark shapes of the trees, listening to the faint sounds of the forest. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense. When I finally went inside, I checked the doors twice to make sure they were locked. On the third day, the noises started. At first, they were faint, so faint I thought maybe I was imagining them. A soft thud against the wall in the middle of the night. A crunch of leaves near the deck when I was eating breakfast. I told myself it was probably animals. Out here, there were plenty of them. Raccoons, deer, maybe even a bear. But the sounds were too close, too deliberate. They didn't feel like an animal moving randomly through the woods. They felt like something moving with purpose. I tried to brush it off, but that night I heard it again. A sound against the wall just beneath the window. Slow, dragging, like something brushing against the wood. I froze in bed, my ears straining, every muscle tense. It stopped after a few seconds, but the silence that followed was worse. I lay awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. My nerves were raw, my body heavy from lack of sleep. I spent the day inside, pacing, checking the windows, peering out into the trees. I saw nothing. The forest looked empty still, but the feeling of being watched never left. When night fell, I sat in the dark, the heater crackling faintly beside me, and tried to steady my breathing. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin, circling. Leaves crunching under weight, moving around the perimeter. I held my breath and didn't move. The footsteps stopped near the back door. The wood creaked softly, as if something pressed against it. Then silence. I stayed frozen until the first light of morning filtered through the windows. When I finally moved, my hands shook so badly I dropped the cup I tried to pick up. I told myself I needed to leave. The trip wasn't worth it. But the car was parked on the far side of the clearing, near the trees. I couldn't bring myself to step outside. Not yet. That day dragged. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the isolation was making me paranoid. But when the sun dipped and the shadows stretched across the floor, the dread returned. That night was the worst yet. The footsteps came back, circling again, slow and steady. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside the window. Then, the sharp sound of metal scraping against wood, like something testing the lock. My chest tightened, and I clutched the small kitchen knife I had taken from the drawer, though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to come in. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound made my heart race. When dawn finally broke, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag quickly, shoving everything inside without care, and waited by the door, knife still in hand. I watched the clearing through the dusty glass, searching for movement. Hours passed. Nothing. Finally, with the sun high enough to give me courage, I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold, my breath visible in front of me. I forced myself to walk to the car, my bag slung over my shoulder, the knife still clutched tightly. My eyes darted to the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out, but the woods were still silent. When I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. I yanked the door open, tossed my bag inside, and slid into the seat. The relief that washed over me when the engine started was overwhelming. I pulled away quickly, gravel spitting from the tires, and didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every bend in the road, every shadow between the trees, felt like a threat. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the main highway and saw another car pass in the opposite direction, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in days. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, back in the noise and movement and people. Only then did I finally feel safe. I never went back to the cabin. I never even asked for my deposit. The thought of stepping foot near those woods again made my skin crawl. What scared me most wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't. I never caught a clear glimpse of anyone, never saw a face, never heard a voice, just the sounds, the footsteps, the scraping, the breathing. Something or someone had been out there watching, circling, waiting, and I will never know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods because I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from everything for a while, away from noise, from work, from people, from the routine that was draining me. I wanted to sit in silence, cook simple food, chop some wood, maybe read and sleep without checking my phone all the time. The cabin I rented was far off the main road, about 2 miles down a rough dirt path that most cars wouldn't even drive on. It wasn't one of those polished vacation cabins people rent for the weekend with Wi-Fi and satellite TV. It was the kind of place that had no signal, no neighbors for miles, and no electricity besides a small generator that the owner told me only ran lights and a fridge. When I got there the first day, I parked my car at the small clearing, unloaded my things, and felt the quiet settle around me. The cabin itself was small, 1 floor, wooden walls, a tin roof, a small porch with 2 old chairs, and the smell of damp earth all around. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched thick with pine, and in front of it there was a rough slope leading down to a stream that I could hear but not see from the porch. It was a good kind of silence at first, the kind that felt heavy but calm. I spent the first day unpacking, checking the kitchen, setting my food supplies in the fridge, and stacking the firewood that had been left under the porch. I walked around the place, looked at the edges of the forest, and thought it would be a good week. The first 2 nights passed in peace. I cooked, I read, I chopped some wood just to have something to do. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the stream and the wind in the trees. The generator was loud, but I turned it off early so I could hear the quiet. When I lay in bed at night, the silence of the forest pressed close, and I could hear the creaks of the cabin and the soft scratching sounds of small animals outside. It was lonely, but it was the kind of lonely I had come for. It was on the third night that things began to change. I was sitting inside at the small table, reading under the yellow light of the cabin bulb, when I thought I heard something outside. At first it was faint, a crunch of leaves or a quick snap of a twig. I assumed it was an animal because out there it could be anything from a raccoon to a deer. But then I heard it again, slower this time, more deliberate, like footsteps moving through the brush. I froze in my chair, listening, stopped after a while, and the silence came back. I waited, telling myself it was nothing, but the way my heart was beating told me I didn't believe that. I turned the generator off early that night, sat in the dark for a while, and listened. The woods made their normal noises, wind brushing through branches, the soft tapping of something against the side of the cabin, the faint flow of the stream. But every now and then I thought I could hear something else, like weight shifting on the leaves or something moving slowly, stopping when I stopped to listen. I went to bed uneasy that night and didn't sleep much. The next day, I tried to push the thought away. I told myself it was wildlife, nothing more. I made breakfast, took a walk down to the stream, and sat on a rock watching the water move. But even then, I felt like something was close. The feeling of being watched would not leave me. Every time I turned around, the trees looked the same, the empty space between them stretching like walls. I kept checking behind me until I made it back to the cabin. That night it grew worse. I had just turned off the lights and was lying in bed when I heard it again. At first it was faint, then clearer, slow, heavy steps on the dry leaves outside, moving in a half circle around the cabin. My breathing slowed, and I didn't move. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the pause, the crunch again. The steps didn't hurry, they were slow, careful, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed but also didn't care if I heard. I lay stiff under the blanket, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds moving outside my window. After a while it stopped, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The morning light should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I walked around the cabin to check, and in the soft ground on one side, I saw prints. They were shoe prints, not animal tracks. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach dropped when I saw them. They were large, deep enough to show weight, and recent. Someone had walked around my cabin in the night. I felt trapped. The dirt path that led out was long, and I didn't know if it was smart to leave the cabin behind with someone possibly out there. I had no phone service, no way to call anyone. I told myself maybe it was a hiker passing through, maybe even the owner checking on the place, though he lived far from here. But the prints circled the cabin, and no hiker or owner would walk around like that at night. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't wander off, didn't go to the stream. I chopped more wood just to keep busy, but I kept looking over my shoulder. My ears caught every sound, every branch that cracked, every bird that stopped singing. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt full of something I couldn't see. When night came, I tried to make the cabin as secure as possible. The door had only one lock, but I shoved a chair under the handle, even though I knew it wouldn't stop much. The windows were old, thin glass, and didn't even lock properly, so I shut them and pulled the curtains tight. I left the generator off, sat in the dark with a small flashlight, and listened. Hours passed, quiet except for the forest, until I heard it again. The steps, slow, crunching on leaves. This time closer, moving from the front of the cabin to the side. My skin prickled as I listened. I couldn't see anything through the curtains, but I knew someone was there. The steps stopped for a while, and then I heard something tap lightly against the side of the wall. Just once, then silence. I didn't move. My throat was dry, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. After what felt like hours, I heard the steps retreat, fading into the distance until there was nothing but the wind again. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the chair with the flashlight in my hand, staring at the door. When the light finally came, I opened the door slowly and looked around. Again, in the dirt and leaves, there were prints, fresh ones, circling the cabin again. This time they came closer to the porch, almost to the steps. Whoever it was had stood there, just a few feet from the door, while I sat inside listening. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. It didn't matter how far it was to the main road. I packed my bag quickly, shoved everything into the car, and started driving. The dirt road was rough, my hands were tight on the wheel, and I kept looking in the mirror. The woods felt like they were closing in around me, and every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there. It took me almost 40 minutes to reach the paved road, and when I finally got there, I didn't stop. I drove until I had signal, pulled into a gas station, and sat there in the parking lot with my heart still racing. I didn't tell anyone the full details. I didn't call the owner to ask if it could have been him. I just left it behind, but the memory has never left me. The sound of those slow steps circling the cabin in the dark, the sight of those fresh shoe prints in the dirt, and the thought that someone stood just outside while I lay inside pretending to sleep, that has stayed with me. It was real. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there in those woods, watching, waiting, and circling my cabin every night. I left that place and I will never go back to a cabin that remote again. The silence I wanted so badly became the very thing that made me helpless. Out there, with no signal, no neighbors, no one to hear me, I realized how easy it would have been for someone to step out of the woods, break a window, and I would have been gone without a trace. I still hear the crunch of those steps in my head at night sometimes, and I know I was lucky to leave when I did. That trip taught me that the scariest thing in the woods isn't the animals or the sounds you can't explain. It's the people you don't see, the ones who move slowly in the dark and don't care if you hear them. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The cabin I rented sat at the far end of a dirt road that cut through thick woods in a part of the state I had never been before. It was an old hunting cabin, small and rough, with no electricity or running water, but that was part of why I chose it. I wanted to be away from the noise and pace of everything, to spend some time alone without my phone buzzing or cars passing by. I pictured quiet mornings with coffee heating on the wood stove, afternoons walking the trails, evenings writing in my notebook by the firelight. That was the image I carried with me when I loaded my supplies into the car and set off toward the mountains. The drive itself took longer than I thought. Once I left the paved highway, the roads narrowed, winding deeper between tall trees that leaned over the gravel. The air grew cooler as I climbed, and the forest seemed to close around me in a way that felt both calm and unsettling. I didn't see another vehicle the last hour of the drive. My cell service had dropped off completely, and I kept glancing at the map I had printed in case I missed a turn. The road got rougher, full of dips and washouts. It was late afternoon by the time I finally spotted the clearing where the cabin sat. The place was smaller than I imagined. It leaned slightly on one side, as if the ground beneath had shifted. The wood siding had gone gray with weather, the roof sagged, and the windows were dark. A short porch wrapped around the front, the boards soft under my boots. I stood there a moment just listening. The forest around the clearing was dense, thick with pine and brush, so quiet I could hear my own breathing. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every snap of a twig. Inside the cabin, the air was musty. The single room held a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner with a thin mattress. A pile of split logs sat by the stove, dry and ready to burn. There was a small back window looking out into trees that pressed close. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I set down my bags, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and lit a lantern. The first night was calm. I made a simple dinner from a can, read a few pages by lantern light, and then lay down listening to the forest outside. The sound of the wind in the trees was steady, and every now and then a branch snapped or leaves rustled. It took me a while to relax enough to sleep, but when I did, I slept hard. The second day I hiked. A narrow trail started at the edge of the clearing and wound into the woods. The forest was dense, the ground soft with layers of pine needles. I carried a small pack with water, jerky, and a map I had printed. For hours I didn't see a soul. I liked the stillness at first, but the deeper I went, the heavier it felt. Every sound echoed. A squirrel darting through the brush, the flap of wings when a bird lifted off, the snap of a branch beneath my boot. I kept turning my head, expecting to see someone, but no one was there. At one point, I noticed boot tracks pressed into the soft ground of the trail. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, sharp at the edges, not yet worn by rain or wind. The prints were wide, from heavy boots, leading in the same direction I was going. I paused, listening, scanning the trees. The forest was quiet. I told myself they could be from a hunter or another hiker, but I hadn't seen a car on the road. Whoever left them had to be close. I followed the trail another half-mile before I stopped. Something about the prints unsettled me. I didn't want to run into anyone out here, not this far in, not alone. I turned back, trying not to think about it, but the image of those boot tracks stayed in my mind the rest of the day. That night, the woods felt different. I kept the lantern burning longer, listening harder to the sounds outside. The forest creaked and shifted with the wind, but every now and then I thought I heard something else. A dull thud, like a step on damp earth. A scrape like wood dragging against wood. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the back window, but when I looked again it was gone. I told myself I was letting my mind run. Still, I shoved the table against the door before I went to bed. On the third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some of the wood stacked outside and carried it in. The clearing felt exposed, and every time I stepped out, I found myself scanning the tree line. The tracks came back into my mind, and I wondered who had made them, if they were out there watching me even now. I kept trying to shrug it off, but the unease didn't leave. That night, I woke to a noise. It was sharp, sudden, not like the usual forest sounds. My eyes opened in the dark, the lantern burned out, and I lay there listening. I heard it again, wood creaking, close, too close, like a footstep on the porch. My chest tightened. I stayed still, barely breathing. The creak came again, heavier this time, followed by a soft thump against the wall. My heart hammered. I reached for the lantern, fumbling with the match, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to light it. When the flame finally caught and the small glow spread through the room, the cabin was empty. The walls cast long shadows, but nothing moved. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat at the table, staring at the door, the lantern burning low. Every now and then, I thought I heard the faintest crunch of footsteps outside, circling, stopping, starting again. I wanted to throw open the door and shine a light into the clearing, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I stayed inside, waiting for dawn. When daylight came, the clearing looked normal again. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about leaving, but the road back was long, and I told myself maybe I was being foolish, that the noises could have been animals, the wind. I forced myself through the day, trying to distract my mind with chores, but the unease never left. The fourth night was worse. It started the same, quiet at first, the forest sounds rising and falling, but then came the noise again. This time it was clearer. Footsteps, heavy, slow, moving across the porch. Then the sound of something brushing against the door, dragging. My stomach turned to ice. The steps moved around the cabin, circling. I followed them with my ears, hearing them pause at the back wall, then at the window, then back to the porch. I sat frozen, gripping the lantern. The air inside felt tight, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound that nearly made me drop the lantern. The door handle rattled. A slow, deliberate turn, metal scraping metal. Someone was testing it. I had shoved the table back against the door earlier, and I stared at it now, willing it to hold. The handle rattled again, harder this time, then stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I sat there for hours, waiting for them to return. When dawn came, I stumbled outside, looking for tracks, any sign of what I had heard. The ground was damp from dew, and at first I saw nothing. Then, near the porch steps, I found them. Boot prints, wide and deep, the same as on the trail. They led from the trees to the cabin, circled it, and disappeared back into the forest. I packed my things fast. I didn't care about the food I had left or the extra gear. I shoved what I could into my bag, doused the lantern, and locked the door behind me, though I knew it wouldn't matter. My only thought was getting back to the car. The walk to the car was the longest of my life. The trail back to the road felt twice as long, every sound behind me sharp, every shift of the trees making me spin around. Once, I swore I heard footsteps matching mine, just out of sight, pausing when I paused, moving when I moved. I didn't look back. I kept walking until I saw the road, until I saw my car through the trees. When I reached it, I dropped the bag in the back and slammed the doors shut, locking them. My hands shook as I started the engine. The sound of it roared in the silence, but it was the only sound I wanted to hear. I drove fast down the rough road, the car bouncing over ruts, branches scraping the sides, not slowing until I saw the first sign of pavement. I didn't stop until I reached town. Only then, in the light of day with other cars passing, did I feel like I could breathe again. I never went back for the rest of my things at the cabin. I never asked about who else might have been out there. Some part of me didn't want to know. The tracks, the footsteps, the rattling door, that was enough. I had gone to the woods for quiet, but what I found was something watching, waiting, moving in the dark outside thin wooden walls. That was the last time I went looking for solitude in a place that empty. I learned the silence of the woods is not always peaceful. Sometimes it means you are truly alone, and sometimes it means someone else is there with you, staying quiet too. I had taken the trip to the cabin because I wanted time away from everything. My job had been stressing me out, and I had grown tired of hearing phones ring, cars honking, and people always rushing. I wanted silence. I wanted to be far away from the noise. The cabin I rented sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest small town. The man who owned it said hardly anyone came out this way anymore, that hunters used to rent it, but now most people just stayed closer to the highway or in newer campsites. That was what I liked about it. It meant I would be left alone. The cabin wasn't much, just a square wooden building with a single front porch, a tin roof, and 2 small windows on the front side. The inside smelled faintly of old wood and smoke from the fireplace, which was the only heat source. There was no electricity except for a small gas generator in the shed, and the water came from a hand pump outside. It was simple, but that was exactly what I wanted. My first day there was calm. I unpacked my bag, put away my food in the cooler, and set some wood by the fireplace. I walked around the property, which wasn't much more than a clearing surrounded by tall trees. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and the air was cool and still. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the forest, but I didn't go far. I wanted to save that for another day. That first night, I built a fire in the fireplace, cooked some canned food on the small gas stove, and listened to the woods outside. The silence was different than in the city. Here it felt heavy, like the trees and darkness pressed down around the cabin. I heard a few animal sounds, some branches breaking, an owl calling, but mostly it was just still. I went to bed early, the fire dying down, the cabin creaking now and then as the woods settled. The next day, I woke early and walked down the trail behind the cabin. The woods were thicker than I expected, and the deeper I went, the darker it felt. The trees grew close together, and the air was damp and cool. I followed the trail for about a mile before I decided to turn back. I didn't want to get lost. On the way back, though, I noticed something strange. Off the trail, maybe 50 yards into the trees, I saw a structure. It was hard to make out through the branches at first, but then I realized it was another cabin. Smaller than mine, darker in color, almost hidden by the trees. I hadn't been told there was another cabin nearby. The owner had said the place was private and that no one else would be around. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to decide if I should go closer. But something about it made me uneasy. The roof looked sagged in the middle, the windows dark, the front door slightly open. It looked abandoned. I turned back to my cabin and tried not to think about it. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down. The woods turned dark quickly, and by the time I lit the lantern, the clearing around the cabin was already swallowed by shadows. I was about to go inside when I thought I saw movement at the tree line. Just a quick shift, like someone stepping between 2 trunks. I stared at the spot until my eyes watered, but I didn't see anything again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, and went inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next few days passed in a routine. I collected firewood, cooked simple meals, and walked short distances on the trail. I avoided looking toward the abandoned cabin, but every time I was outside, I felt the urge to glance into the trees, like I might see someone standing there. At night, I sometimes thought I heard faint noises, like footsteps on leaves or something brushing against the cabin walls. But whenever I got up to check, there was nothing. On the fourth night, I woke up suddenly. The fire had gone out, and the room was cold. I lay still, listening. That was when I heard it. The sound of something moving outside. Not just an animal passing by, but steady footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, careful. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I reached for the lantern but didn't light it. I just listened. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. The wood creaked. Something was out there. Someone was out there. I stayed in bed, frozen, too scared to move. After what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few minutes, the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked outside. There were footprints in the dirt by the porch. Human footprints. Not boots, but bare feet. I stared at them for a long time, feeling sick. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night with no shoes on. I thought about leaving, but the small town was over an hour away by car, and I had paid for a full week. I told myself it was probably just some drifter, someone who lived in the woods and didn't mean any harm. I decided to stay, but I kept my hatchet near me at all times. That night, I tried to stay awake, but at some point, I drifted off. When I opened my eyes again, it was still dark. I sat up slowly, and that was when I saw it. Through the small window above the bed, a face was looking in. Pale, thin, eyes wide open, staring right at me. I froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the face slowly disappeared into the darkness. I grabbed the hatchet and ran outside, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent. The footprints from the night before were still visible, but no new ones. It was as if whoever it was had vanished. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That face, thin, dirty, with hollow eyes. It didn't look curious. It didn't look harmless. It looked hungry. I walked back toward the abandoned cabin that afternoon, even though I didn't want to. I felt like I needed to see it up close, to know if that person had come from there. When I reached it, I stopped several yards away. The place was even worse than I thought. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging, the door hanging open. Inside, I could see broken furniture, trash, and what looked like piles of old blankets in the corner. Someone had been living there. I didn't go inside. I turned and walked quickly back to my cabin, my skin crawling. That night, the noises came again. This time, I heard breathing outside the walls. Slow, steady breathing, like someone pressing their face against the wood. Then I heard scratching. Not loud, just the faint sound of fingernails dragging along the logs. I stayed in bed, gripping the hatchet until the sound stopped. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things, loaded my bag into the car, and got ready to leave. But when I walked around to the driver's side, I stopped. The tires were slashed, all four of them. Deep cuts, the rubber flat against the dirt. My stomach dropped. Whoever was out there didn't want me to leave. The nearest town was too far to walk, and I had no phone signal this deep in the woods. I was trapped. I spent the day boarding up the windows as best I could and stacking firewood by the door. I filled pots with water from the pump, set my food on the table, and kept the hatchet in my hand. The sun went down slowly, the woods darkening around me, and I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. That night, the noises started early. Footsteps circling, scratching at the walls, a soft tapping on the windows. I lit the fire and sat against the wall, waiting. Hours passed like that, until I heard the front porch creak. Then the sound of the doorknob turning. I had locked it, but the knob rattled again and again, harder each time. Then silence. Minutes later, glass shattered. One of the back windows. I ran to the bedroom and shoved the dresser against the door. I could hear movement inside now, soft steps on the wooden floor. The person was in the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall, heart racing, hatchet raised. The steps grew closer. I could see a shadow moving under the crack of the door. Then the dresser shifted just slightly. I held my breath. The shadow stood there for a long time, not moving, just waiting. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps moved away. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. I stayed awake, gripping the hatchet, waiting for the door to break. But it never did. By morning, the cabin was silent again. When I finally stepped out, the inside was a mess. Footprints in the dust. The broken window open to the woods. Whoever it was had come and gone. I didn't wait any longer. I packed what I could carry, left the rest, and started walking down the road. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't look into the trees. I just walked. Took me nearly 7 hours to reach the highway, my legs aching, my throat dry. Finally, a truck stopped and picked me up. The driver looked at me like I was half crazy, but I didn't explain. Later, when I told the sheriff in town what happened, he only nodded. He said people sometimes lived out in those woods, people who didn't want to be found, people who would do anything to keep others away. They checked the cabin, but no one was there. The abandoned one was empty too, just piles of rags and trash. I never went back. I never even asked for my things. Even now, though, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone is outside my window, watching, waiting. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks, mostly because I wanted some time alone to clear my head. Life in the city had been loud and messy, and I felt like I had been drowning in it. I rented a small cabin far out in the woods, a place tucked into the hills near a lake, where no neighbors were close and the roads were just dirt tracks that twisted through tall trees. The idea of being away from people and away from noise sounded good when I booked it. But as I drove deeper into the woods and saw how far I had gotten from the last town, I started to feel a heavy weight in my stomach. The cell service had already dropped out miles back, and the radio stations had gone to static. I felt like I was slowly cutting myself off from everything I knew, like I was walking out of one world and into another. The cabin itself sat at the end of a narrow path. The trees leaned in close on both sides, their branches stretching out high above, shutting out a lot of the daylight. By the time I parked near the cabin and got out of the car, it felt later in the day than it actually was. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just one floor, made of old dark logs that had weathered through years of storms. The roof was tin, rusty around the edges, and there was a short porch in the front with a railing that leaned to one side. A stack of chopped wood sat next to the porch, but it looked old, like it hadn't been touched in months. There were no other cabins in sight, no people, no movement except the trees rocking slightly in the wind. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main room with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. A small kitchen sat against one wall, with a gas stove and a sink that I knew was connected to a pump outside. The bedroom was just a square room with a bed, a dresser, and a single small window that looked into the forest. The bathroom was little more than a toilet hooked up to a tank and a shower stall with a curtain that didn't quite close all the way. Everything smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and damp fabric. It wasn't dirty, but it felt abandoned. Even though I had the keys and the rental papers, I had this sense that I was moving into someone else's forgotten space. I brought my bags in from the car slowly, taking more trips than I needed to, partly to stall and partly because I couldn't shake the nervous feeling in my chest. Each time I stepped outside, I looked around at the forest. The woods pressed close, so thick and quiet that even my own footsteps on the porch seemed louder than they should have been. I kept glancing back down the narrow dirt road, the way I had come, expecting to see something there even though nothing moved. I told myself it was just nerves. I had wanted isolation, and now that I had it, it was natural to feel uneasy. That's what I thought then. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked, got the pump going for water, and lit a fire in the wood stove to take the damp chill out of the air. I cooked something simple on the gas stove and ate at the table while looking out the window, where the trees stood like a wall. At night, when the sun dropped, the cabin sank into a darkness I hadn't felt in years. In the city, even at night, there was always a glow from the streets, from windows, from cars passing by. Here, When the last light left the sky, there was nothing but black pressing against the windows. The only light came from the small lamps in the cabin and the orange glow of the fire. The silence was so thick that every pop of the firewood made me jump a little. I went to bed early, pulling the blanket over me, listening to the faint creaks of the cabin as it settled in the night air. Sleep came slow, and when I finally drifted off, it was restless, filled with half-dreams where I felt like I was still lying awake. The next morning, I woke up stiff and tired. The air was cold, and the window beside the bed was fogged from my breath. I got up, made coffee on the stove, and stepped outside with the mug. The forest was still, the air damp, the ground covered with pine needles and dead leaves. I listened for birds, for animals, but heard nothing. It was strange how empty it felt, like even the animals avoided this place. As I stood there, sipping my coffee, I noticed something in the dirt near the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a patch of shadows, but then I realized it was a footprint, a human footprint. The soil was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the mark was clear. The heel, the toes, the arch, it was unmistakable. It wasn't mine either. It was bigger, wider, and fresher than anything I would have left yesterday while unloading. Pointed toward the cabin. I felt my chest tighten as I crouched down to look at it closer. The print wasn't old. It hadn't been washed out by rain or filled with leaves. It looked like it had been made in the last day or two. I stood up slowly and looked around the trees. They swayed slightly in the breeze, but nothing moved between them. I told myself it could have been left by a hiker or a hunter passing through before I got here, maybe even the owner of the cabin. Still, the direction of the print bothered me. It faced straight toward where I was standing. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the unease. I hiked a little along the dirt road, gathered some dry wood for the stove, and tried to keep myself busy. But every time I looked at the edge of the woods, I thought of that footprint. When the sun went down, I felt the weight of the darkness even heavier than the night before. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and sat near the stove, trying to read a book I had brought. But my mind kept drifting. I thought I heard noises outside, small crunches in the leaves, faint cracks of branches. But whenever I held my breath and listened, the sounds stopped. The silence pressed back in. I told myself it was animals, even though I hadn't seen or heard any yet. I stayed up too late, fighting off sleep, because the idea of lying in the dark bedroom with only a thin wall between me and the woods made my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to bed. It was sometime in the night when I woke up. My eyes opened slowly, and for a moment I didn't know why I was awake. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cabin was quiet. Then I heard it, a faint sound. It wasn't inside, but just outside the cabin, near the porch. A slow creak of wood, like weight pressing down on the old boards. My heart thudded hard in my chest as I lay there, holding my breath. The sound came again, one board shifting under weight. Someone was on the porch. I stayed frozen in the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. I listened for movement, for footsteps, for the sound of the door handle turning. But after that second creak, nothing came. The silence stretched on, longer and longer, until I started to wonder if I had imagined it. But the fear stayed with me. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there wide awake, staring at the faint glow of the stove through the crack in the bedroom door. The next morning, I forced myself to check the porch. My stomach churned as I opened the front door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But it was empty. The boards sat quiet. The railing leaned as it had before. I stepped out slowly, looking at the ground. That's when I saw them. More footprints. They weren't just at the edge of the woods anymore. They were on the porch itself. Clear marks pressed into the dirt and dust of the boards, leading right up to the door. My chest felt hollow as I realized someone had stood just feet away from where I had been lying inside. I backed into the cabin and locked the door, my hands shaking. My mind spun with thoughts. Had they been watching me yesterday? Were they still out there now, waiting in the trees? I wanted to get in the car and leave, but the dirt road stretched miles through the forest before reaching the main road, and something about the thought of driving it alone with the trees pressing in and no one around, felt just as dangerous. I tried to convince myself it could be the owner checking on the cabin or someone passing by, but I knew deep down that wasn't it. The prints were too fresh, too close. Whoever it was had come in the night quietly and stood at my door. I drove up into the mountains late that afternoon, my truck heavy with supplies and my chest filled with the kind of tired excitement that only comes from leaving behind the noise of towns and roads. I had rented the cabin for a week. It sat tucked back in the woods off a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. That was what I wanted. Silence, no neighbors, no passing cars, no cell towers, nothing but trees and the crackle of fire at night. I carried in food, bottled water, a small generator, and my hunting rifle. I wasn't planning to hunt, but being this deep in the woods without protection didn't feel smart. There were bears, mountain lions, maybe even wolves. I liked knowing I had something in case I needed it. The cabin itself was small, one floor with 2 rooms. A front room with a stove, a table, a couch, and a back room that was just big enough for a bed and a closet. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet away. No running water, no electricity except what I could pull from the generator. By the time I unpacked, the sun was sinking. The forest outside the cabin windows darkened quick, like someone pulled a blanket over it. I started a fire in the small wood stove and sat on the couch, listening to it pop. At first, I felt that peace I had been craving, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own thoughts settle. But then, in that same quiet, I began to notice how many other noises existed out there. The creak of trees bending, the faint snap of branches as animals moved unseen, the whistle of wind slipping between trunks. Every sound felt sharper than it should. I reminded myself that I wasn't used to real silence. In town, there was always the hum of cars, neighbors' voices, distant sirens. Out here, every noise stood out. That night, I cooked canned soup on the stove, ate, and stretched out on the bed. The mattress was old but firm. The sheets smelled faintly of dust. As I lay there, I noticed the window near the bed didn't have any curtains, just plain glass. The forest pressed right up against it, black trees like long shadows, the sky a faint smear of stars above. I found myself staring at the glass longer than I should, waiting for something to move out there. I told myself it was nerves. I rolled over and forced myself to sleep. The first few days went fine. I spent my mornings hiking trails near the cabin, cutting through thick pines and rocky slopes. I would come back with firewood, cook, sit outside with coffee, and watch the sun crawl down between the branches. I didn't see another person, not a single car, not even smoke from another chimney. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself. But on the 3rd evening, something small shifted. I was sitting outside on the front steps, watching the last light slip away, when I heard a crunch in the woods. Heavy, slow, like a boot pressing into damp ground. My chest tightened right away. It wasn't the skitter of a rabbit or the light step of a deer. This sounded heavy. I froze and listened. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then, another crunch. Farther away this time, but still human sounding. I stood, staring into the trees, but the light was nearly gone. The woods had already turned into a wall of black. I told myself it could be a bear. Bears were big enough to sound like that. Still, I went inside, locked the cabin door, and sat near the window for an hour, staring into the dark until my eyes ached. Nothing moved, and eventually I went to bed. The next morning, I found tracks. Not animal tracks, boots, clear as day in the soft dirt near the edge of the trees. They weren't mine either. I hadn't been in that part of the clearing. The prints were deep, the stride long, like whoever left them was tall. They stopped about 30 feet from the cabin, then turned back into the trees. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been close to the cabin, standing there in the dark while I sat inside. I tried to reason it out. Maybe a hiker passed through. Maybe someone from another cabin had wandered by. But I hadn't seen a single sign of anyone else out here, and the tracks came too close, stopping in a way that didn't look like someone just passing through. It looked like they stood there watching. That day, I kept busy. I chopped more wood than I needed, checked over the cabin doors, and made sure the rifle was loaded. I carried it with me even inside. I told myself I was overreacting, but every time I glanced at the trees, I thought I saw movement. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin sounded like a footstep. Every brush of wind against the window sounded like breathing. At one point, I thought I heard something touch the cabin wall outside. Just a faint scrape, like a hand running along the wood. I sat up with the rifle in my lap until the first pale light of morning. On the 5th day, I decided I would leave early. The week-long stay no longer felt like peace. It felt like waiting for something I didn't want to face. But when I went to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over. At first I thought it was the cold, but when I checked under the hood, I saw wires had been cut. Clean cut, not chewed by animals. Someone had done it. The panic that hit me then was sharp and immediate. I wasn't imagining things. Someone was out there, and they had been close enough to sabotage my truck in the night. I spent the rest of the day inside, the rifle always near. I ate only a little, saving food in case I'd be stuck here longer than I planned. The generator hummed faintly, but I turned it off to keep the noise down. I wanted to hear everything outside. That night was the longest of my life. I sat on the couch in the dark, the rifle across my lap, my ears straining. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. At times, they stopped, and the silence was worse than the sound. Then they started again, shifting from one side of the cabin to the other. Once, something brushed the window. Not a knock, not a scratch, just the faint pressure of weight against glass. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I kept the rifle ready, my finger tight near the trigger. Whoever was out there didn't try the door, didn't break a window. They just circled, paced, paused, like they were waiting. When the sun finally rose, the footsteps stopped. I opened the door cautiously and looked around. More tracks in the dirt, circling the cabin. Big boots, same as before. They hadn't tried to hide them. If anything, it felt like they wanted me to see. I stayed inside all day, exhausted but too scared to sleep. I thought about trying to hike out, but the nearest road was miles away through thick forest. If the person out there was watching, they could easily follow me, maybe even cut me off. At least in the cabin, I had some shelter, some defense. That night was worse. The footsteps came back, louder, closer. I heard the outhouse door slam shut like someone had kicked it. Later, I swore I heard quiet breathing right against the back wall of the cabin. My hands shook so bad I nearly dropped the rifle. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could carry into my backpack. Food, water, ammo. And as soon as the sun was fully up, I set out on foot down the dirt road. Every step, I expected to hear someone behind me. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder, my eyes darting between trees. For miles, I didn't see or hear anything. The woods were empty except for the usual rustle of animals. But when I stopped to rest, I noticed it again. Boot tracks, fresh ones, pressed into the dirt road behind me. They hadn't been there when I first walked that stretch. Someone was following me, keeping distance but staying close enough. I walked faster, my chest tight, my throat dry no matter how much water I drank. The road twisted and turned, and every bend felt like a trap. I kept imagining stepping around a curve and seeing someone standing there, waiting. It took me most of the day, but finally I reached the highway. When I stepped out of the trees and saw a car pass in the distance, I nearly dropped to my knees. I flagged down the next vehicle that came by, and the driver, an older man in a pickup, gave me a strange look but let me climb in. When I looked back at the tree line, I thought I saw movement. A figure, tall and still, standing just at the edge of the woods. I blinked, and it was gone. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone the full story, either. People would think I imagined it, that I scared myself in the woods. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in those tracks, in the cut wires, in the way someone walked circles around the cabin in the dark. They never tried to break in. They never attacked outright. They just waited night after night, letting the fear sink deeper. The worst part is knowing they could still be out there, in those woods, waiting for the next person who wants a quiet week alone in the cabin. I had been looking forward to spending some quiet time in the cabin for months. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine, but he let me use it whenever I wanted, since he rarely came up to the mountains himself anymore. It was small and old, sitting deep in the woods where there were no neighbors close by, just thick trees, rocks, and the faint sound of a creek that ran about a quarter-mile away. The road that led to it was narrow and bumpy, more of a dirt trail than a real road, and the last part could only be done on foot because the ground was uneven and filled with rocks. I packed food, water, clothes, a flashlight, batteries, and some tools in case anything broke down inside. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove, an old gas lantern, and a couple of creaky beds with thin mattresses. The walls were made of logs stacked tightly, but the wood had darkened over time and carried a faint smell of dampness mixed with smoke. The roof slanted low, and the windows were covered with shutters that could be barred from the inside. When I first arrived, the air was cool but not cold. It was early evening, and the forest around me felt calm. The sky above the trees was fading from pale blue to gray, and I could hear insects buzzing in the brush. I unlocked the cabin door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots. Dust floated in the air where the fading light pushed through the cracks. I set my bag on the wooden table in the middle of the one-room cabin. There was a small stove in the corner, a couple of shelves with canned food, a bench, and the two beds against the far wall. Everything looked the same as the last time I had been there, untouched and silent. I lit the lantern and set it on the table. The warm glow filled the cabin and pushed the shadows back against the corners. After eating a quick meal of bread and canned beans, I stepped outside to take in the air before night fully came. The woods around the cabin were thick, the trees growing close together, their trunks black against the fading light. I listened to the faint sounds, wind moving through the branches, the creek rushing faintly in the distance, and somewhere far off the call of a bird. But then I heard something else. It was faint, almost easy to miss. It sounded like a branch snapping under weight, not far from where the path curved into the trees. I stayed still for a long moment, staring toward the sound, but the woods looked quiet. I told myself it was just an animal moving around. There were plenty of deer, raccoons, even the occasional bear in these parts. Still, the sound left me uneasy. I went back inside, slid the wooden bar across the door, and pulled the shutters closed over the windows. I added wood to the stove, and soon the cabin filled with warmth. I tried to relax, sitting on the bench, listening to the crackle of the fire, but my mind kept going back to the sound outside. That night, I lay in the bed on the left side of the room, the thin blanket pulled over me. The lantern was turned low, but I left it burning because the cabin felt too dark without it. At first, I drifted into a light sleep, but something woke me, a sound. At first, I couldn't tell if I had dreamed it or if it was real. It came again, soft, steady footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, my heart thudding. The cabin door was locked and barred, but the sound of weight shifting across the porch boards was clear. Slow, deliberate steps. I waited, staring at the door, every muscle tight. The steps stopped, then silence. I lay there for hours, it seemed, until finally exhaustion pulled me into restless sleep. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the porch boards showed marks. They were faint, but I saw them clearly, boot prints in the thin layer of dirt and pine needles. Not animal tracks, human. Someone had been standing there. The woods felt different after that. Every sound seemed sharper. Every movement of the branches seemed like more than just the wind. I walked a little around the cabin, checking the trees, the edges of the clearing, but saw no one. Still, the tracks were fresh. Someone had been right there during the night. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it might have been some hunter or hiker who stumbled on the cabin, maybe just curious. But the thought of a stranger standing on the porch while I slept inside gnawed at me. I decided to stay alert. I gathered extra wood for the stove, checked my supplies, and kept the lantern filled. All day, I moved around with a kind of nervous energy, glancing toward the trees every time I thought I heard something. By evening, the sky grew heavy with clouds, and the woods darkened early. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake, listening. Hours passed, but then, just as I felt my eyes drifting shut, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, dragging slightly, not on the porch this time, but moving around the cabin itself. A crunch of leaves, a crack of a twig, then silence, then another step. Someone was circling the cabin. I stayed frozen in bed, my hand clutching the flashlight beside me. The footsteps went around the walls, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, until finally they stopped. I waited, every second stretched out, until eventually the only sound was the wind through the trees. When morning came, I checked again. Around the cabin in the dirt and leaves were tracks. Boots again. The prints circled the entire cabin, some close enough to brush against the logs themselves. Whoever it was had walked around me while I lay inside. I felt a heavy pressure in my chest. This wasn't someone passing by. This was someone watching, someone who came back a second night, closer this time. I thought about leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and I had come up on foot. I decided to wait through the day, stay locked inside at night, and leave in the morning when I had full light to make the long walk out. The day dragged by. I barely ate. I kept the shutters closed and the door barred, listening to every sound outside. The woods were alive with small noises, branches snapping, squirrels running, birds flapping, but I kept thinking about heavier footsteps. When night came, I stacked wood by the stove, lit the lantern, and sat on the bench. I felt too tense to lie down. I listened, staring at the door, waiting. Hours went by, the fire burning low, the lantern hissing softly. Then I heard it, a creak on the porch. Then another. Whoever it was, they were back. The steps paused. Then, slow and steady, they pressed against the door itself. The wood creaked as weight leaned against it. My chest felt tight, every breath shallow. Then came the sound of fingers brushing along the door, dragging across the surface. I stayed silent, not moving. The bar across the door was thick, but I knew the wood was old. If someone really wanted to force their way in, they could. After a long stretch, the sound stopped. The porch boards creaked again as the weight shifted back. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair until the first faint light of morning pushed through the cracks in the shutters. When I finally dared to open the door, the porch showed fresh prints. Clear, heavy boots. They had stood there for a long time. I didn't pack much. I just shoved food and my flashlight into my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and left. The woods felt too quiet as I walked down the path toward the dirt road. Every time I looked behind me, the trees seemed too still, as if someone could be standing there, watching. The trail wound downhill, the brush thick on both sides. My legs felt weak, my ears straining for sounds behind me. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. I turned. Far back up the trail, half hidden between the trees, a figure stood. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I turned and kept walking, faster now, almost running, my heart hammering. I didn't look back until I reached the dirt road. When I did, the trail behind me was empty, but I knew he had been there. I walked the rest of the long road until I reached the spot where I had left my car. Every step I felt the weight of eyes on me, though the trees stayed still. When I reached the car, I unlocked it fast, threw my bag inside, and drove until the road turned to asphalt and the woods fell behind. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. I told my friend I wouldn't use it anymore. The cabin still stands there, deep in the woods, but I know someone else is out there too. Someone who comes at night, walking slowly in the dark, watching from the trees. And I don't think he ever left. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. I wanted to get away from everything. No phones, no emails, no cars driving past my window, no people knocking at my door. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you can only get when you're far out in the woods. I rented a cabin I found through a listing that a friend recommended. It wasn't big, just a one-bedroom place with a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a wood stove. It was surrounded by pines and birches, far enough from the nearest road that you had to take a dirt track that twisted through the trees for nearly a mile before you saw the roof. I arrived in the afternoon. The drive up had been quiet, and once I parked, I just stood there for a moment with the door of my car open, breathing in the stillness. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. The trees swayed only a little, the sound of the wind brushing through their tops. No voices, no distant engines, not even a plane overhead. Just silence. The cabin itself looked old but kept up. The wood siding was weathered gray, and the porch had 2 chairs, one missing a slat on the seat. The windows were clean, and when I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and cold air wrapped around me. The floors creaked under my boots. I put my bag on the small bed and walked around to get a feel for the place. The kitchen was simple, 2 counters, a sink with a small pump, a stove that ran on propane, and a tiny fridge powered by a gas line. The bathroom had a narrow shower, a toilet, and nothing else. Everything felt like it belonged 50 years back in time. After unloading my gear, I stacked some firewood near the stove and got a fire going. The heat took the edge off the cold inside, and the flames gave the cabin a glow that made it feel less empty. I boiled some water on the stove for tea and sat by the window while the sun went down. Watching the light fade through the trees gave me a strange calm. When darkness finally settled in, I turned on the one small lamp in the cabin. It had a yellow shade that filled the room with a soft glow. Outside, it was pitch black. I couldn't see more than a foot past the glass, only my own reflection staring back at me. That first night, I read for a while and then lay in bed, listening to the fire die down. It was quiet, so quiet that every tiny sound stood out. The tick of the stove, the creak of wood shifting as the cabin cooled, the faint scrape of branches against the roof. I woke around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. As I moved through the cabin, I noticed how absolute the silence was. It wasn't like being in the city at night, where there's always some background noise. Here, even my breathing felt loud. I went back to bed, pulled the blanket up, and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, I made coffee on the stove and sat outside on the porch with a cup in my hands. The air was sharp and cold, and steam rose with every sip. The forest was still, but I noticed small movements here and there. Birds hopping along the ground, a squirrel running up a tree, the faint crash of something larger moving deeper in the woods, maybe a deer. It all felt right, exactly what I wanted. I spent the day chopping some wood, walking the trail that led from the cabin down to a small creek, and cooking a simple meal. The whole time, I didn't see or hear another person. By the time the sun started dropping, I felt both worn out and strangely energized. It was like I'd stepped out of my regular life completely. That night, though, I felt something different. I had locked the cabin door even though it was unlikely anyone would come out here, but I still kept glancing at it. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't completely alone. It wasn't a clear feeling, just something that kept slipping into my mind while I tried to read. The trees outside were so dense that I couldn't see anything, but that didn't mean nothing was there. At some point, while I was sitting by the fire, I thought I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like the crunch of leaves under a foot. I froze, listening hard. After a few seconds, nothing followed. I told myself it was probably an animal, raccoon, maybe a fox, or even a deer. Still, I found myself staring at the window again. The lamp inside turned the glass into a mirror, so I couldn't see the yard or the tree line beyond. Anything could have been out there. I shook it off, went to bed, and slept. But my sleep wasn't as easy that night. I woke more than once, not because of noise, but because I felt on edge. Every time, I listened for sounds, but there was nothing but the creaks of the cabin settling. By the 3rd day, I'd settled into a routine. Wake up, make coffee, walk, gather wood, cook, read, and sleep. I liked it, but that strange edge never completely left. The cabin felt both safe and unsafe at the same time. It was strong and solid, but it was also isolated, far from help if something went wrong. That afternoon, I walked farther along the creek than I had before. The water moved slow and shallow over the stones, and the air smelled damp. After maybe an hour, I noticed something odd. On the muddy bank, there were footprints. They were too large for any animal and too clear to be old. They looked like boot prints, heading in the direction of my cabin. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time. The tread wasn't mine. My boots left a different pattern, and these looked fresher than anything I'd made. My chest felt tight as I followed them. They went along the creek, then cut into the trees, roughly toward the way I'd walked earlier. I kept going until I realized they headed directly toward the direction of my cabin. I stood there, trying to decide what to do. I told myself maybe someone else had walked the area before me. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker. But I hadn't seen a soul since arriving, and the listing had made it sound like this place was all but forgotten. I went back to the cabin faster than I'd planned, my eyes darting to the trees every few seconds. By the time I stepped onto the porch, I was sweating even though the air was cool. I checked the door, still locked, windows closed, nothing out of place inside. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. The idea of someone else being in the woods with me, someone who hadn't announced themselves, unsettled me more than I could admit. I built the fire higher and sat closer to it. The glow seemed like the only thing pushing the darkness back. Around midnight, I heard it again. A crunch outside, not just once, several times. Slow, measured, like steps. My heart started hammering. I sat perfectly still, every nerve straining. The steps stopped, and then silence filled the air again. I didn't move for nearly half an hour, listening, waiting. Finally, I stood, walked quietly to the door, and checked the lock again. Solid. Then I looked at the window. My reflection looked back at me, but behind it was nothing but blackness. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the blanket tight under my chin. Every shift of wood in the walls made me tense. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone standing outside, just beyond sight, waiting. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch and looked down. In the dirt at the bottom of the steps were marks. Not clear prints, but scuffs, as if someone had walked there. My chest went tight again. I looked around, scanning the trees, but the forest stared back at me blankly. The day dragged. I tried to distract myself with chores, chopping wood, carrying water, cooking, but every sound from outside pulled my attention. A bird landing, a squirrel dropping from a branch, branches shifting in the wind. All of it made me jump. By the time the sun went down, I was exhausted but more awake than ever. That night, the sounds came back. Steps, a pause, another step, then silence again. I sat by the fire with my hands balled into fists. My mind ran through possibilities. A hunter? A lost hiker? Someone living rough out here? None of them made me feel better. It went on like that for 2 more nights. Every day, I saw signs. Scuffs in the dirt, branches broken where someone had walked, faint impressions of boots near the creek. Every night, the sounds came back. Steps outside, circling, always slow, always patient. Never rushing, never trying to break in, just there. By the 5th night, I couldn't take it. I sat in the chair by the window with the lamp off, staring into the dark, my eyes straining to catch movement. The fire burned low, the cabin half-shadowed. That's when I finally saw it. A shape between the trees. Still, watching. It wasn't clear. Not a face, not clothes. Just the outline of a person standing at the edge of the tree line. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't sleep. To first light, I packed my bag. I didn't bother with breakfast. I loaded everything into the car as fast as I could, checking over my shoulder the entire time. The woods were quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet. Too heavy, too still. When I started the engine, the sound was so loud it felt unnatural. I drove down the dirt track, the trees closing in on both sides. I didn't look in the mirror. I had been needing a break from everything for a while, so I made plans to get away from my daily routine and spend some days in an old cabin in the woods. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought I would just sit out there, away from all the noise of people, cars, and work, and I would just hear the wind, the birds, and nothing else. That was what I wanted. Silence. Time to myself. Nothing but the sound of trees moving. I had found the cabin through a friend of a friend. It wasn't on any rental site. It was just an old place someone owned, and they didn't really use it anymore. It was about 30 miles away from the nearest town, set back on a dirt road that cut through thick forest. The first time I saw it, it didn't look like much. Just a square wooden box with a pitched roof, sitting on a little clearing surrounded by endless pines. It had a front porch with a broken railing, and the paint on the wood had long faded. The cabin looked tired. The wood was dark from years of weather. The roof had moss on it, but the place was still standing, and the inside had everything I needed for a week. A small wood stove, a creaky bed, a kitchen with some old pots and pans, and a pump for water a short walk behind it. No electricity, no cell service, just the cabin, the trees, and me. At first, it was exactly what I wanted. I got there late in the afternoon, parked my truck at the edge of the clearing, and unloaded my things. The dirt road ended right near the cabin, and the forest pressed close around it on all sides, so it really felt cut off from everything. I stacked my food in the little kitchen, made my bed with the sleeping bag I had brought, and opened the windows to air the place out. The air smelled of wood, old dust, and faintly of damp, but after a few minutes it wasn't bad. That first night, I built a small fire in the stove, cooked some beans in a pan, and ate while sitting at the little table by the window. The woods outside grew dark fast. The cabin had only one small oil lamp, and the flame flickered weakly, barely pushing the dark back. I lay in bed, listening to the fire die down, and eventually to the silence outside. No cars, no people, just whined through the trees. It felt strange at first, too quiet, but I kept telling myself this was what I came for. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch of leaves or sticks, but it was sharp in that deep silence. I lay in bed, eyes open, staring into the black room. The cabin had no curtains, and through the window I could see faint starlight. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon moving near the cabin. The woods were full of animals. Still, my body stayed tense, listening for every little sound. For a while, there was nothing. Then another crunch, this time closer, right outside. I held my breath, straining my ears. I thought about getting up and looking out the window, but part of me didn't want to. I just stayed still, waiting. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I never heard it walk away. The silence stretched so long, I started to wonder if I had imagined it. My heart slowed down, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was a mix of dirt, dead leaves, and pine needles, and I did see some scuffs near the porch. They could have been anything. Maybe deer. Maybe just the wind knocking down branches. I pushed it from my mind. I made coffee on the stove, sat on the porch, and tried to relax. The day was calm. I went for a long walk down the dirt road, just to see how far it went. The road narrowed and eventually turned into more of a trail, swallowed by the trees. The forest felt endless. The air was cool, filled with the smell of pine. I didn't see a single person all day, and by the time I walked back to the cabin, the sun was low. That night, I made another fire, cooked some food, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But when the night came, the unease from before returned. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. I tried to read a book by the oil lamp, but every little creak of the cabin made me lift my head. After a while, I put the lamp out and went to bed. Sometime in the night, I woke again. At first, I didn't know why. I lay there, half asleep, until I heard it. Slow steps outside. Not an animal. Too steady, too heavy. One step, a pause, another step. It was right outside the cabin, circling. My chest tightened. I couldn't move. I just lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening. The steps came to the porch. I heard the wood creak under the weight. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I felt the air in my lungs burn because I was holding my breath. I waited for a knock, for the door to open, for something. Nothing happened. After what felt like forever, the steps moved again, slow, steady, around the cabin. Then silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I forced myself to check again. The dirt around the cabin had faint impressions in it. Not clear prints, just spots where something heavy had pressed down. Could have been boots. Could have been just my imagination. But the porch had new scuffs. Long marks on the wood, right by the door. My stomach sank. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone who thought the cabin was empty. But then why circle it? Why stand on the porch without knocking? Why leave without saying anything? I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably nothing. I had come all this way to get peace, and I wasn't going to scare myself out of it after only 2 nights. So I stayed. That day, though, I didn't enjoy the woods. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time the trees shifted, every time I heard a snap in the distance, I thought someone was there. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already sinking, and my nerves were raw. I decided to barricade the door before bed. The lock was just a simple latch, and it didn't feel secure. So I dragged the small table in front of it, piled a chair and some firewood against it too. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. That night was worse. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, ears straining. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a noise that made my skin crawl. The sound of the doorknob turning. Slow, testing the latch. My body froze. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The knob turned again, rattling softly. Then stillness. I lay there, gripping the edge of the blanket, not moving. Then came a sound at the window. Faint scrape, like a finger or something sharp dragging along the glass. Just once. Then silence again. I didn't sleep at all. When the first light came through the trees, I got up and tore the table away from the door. I opened it fast, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The woods were quiet, but the doorknob had fresh scratches near the base, like someone had tried to force it. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. I started packing my things right away. I stuffed everything into my bag, loaded it into the truck, and tried to start the engine. The key turned, but the engine only sputtered. Again, nothing. The truck had been fine the day before. I popped the hood, checked what little I could, but I'm no mechanic. The only thing I knew was that it wasn't starting, and there was no one around to help. Panic started to rise in me, but I tried to think. The nearest town was 30 miles away. I could walk, but it would take a full day, maybe longer, and I wasn't sure I could even find the way without a map. I decided to stay one more night and leave at first light on foot. That day dragged. I didn't wander far from the cabin. I didn't want to. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I didn't see anyone, but I felt it. By evening, I dragged more furniture against the door. I checked every window, made sure they were latched, though they were old and flimsy. When darkness came, I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, waiting. Hours passed. I sat with my back against the wall, gripping a heavy piece of firewood like a weapon. My eyes ached from straining into the dark. For a while, nothing happened. Then, faintly, I heard movement again. Not steps this time, but a soft rustling, circling the cabin. Slow, careful. My mouth went dry. The sound stopped by the back wall. I held my breath, waiting. Then came a low creak of wood, as if pressure was being put on the wall itself. My mind raced. Were they trying to pry a window? Force the boards? Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the sun was just rising. I got up, checked the cabin. Nothing broken, nothing obvious. But when I stepped outside, I froze. In the dirt all around the cabin were prints. Clear this time. Boots, dozens of them, circling, coming close to the windows, to the door. Someone, or more than one, had spent the night walking around the cabin while I was inside. I had been looking forward to some time away from the city, and when I found the cabin listing online, it felt like the perfect chance. The place was small, old, and tucked away in the woods near a quiet lake. It had no neighbors close by, just trees, water, and silence. That was what I wanted. I wanted to breathe air that didn't smell like exhaust, hear sounds that weren't car horns or shouting, and wake up to nothing but the wind and the birds. The pictures made it look simple and rough, with wood walls darkened by age, a stone chimney, and a porch that faced the lake. The drive out there took hours. The further I got, the narrower the roads became, until I was on a cracked 2-lane highway with long stretches of forest on both sides. I stopped once for gas at a small town, the kind with only a couple of streets and one diner. After that, the directions took me onto a dirt road that twisted deep into the woods. My tires crunched over rocks, and branches scraped against the sides of the car. I drove slowly, nervous about hitting something since I hadn't seen another car in miles. Eventually, the trees opened just enough to show the roof of the cabin. The place looked even more isolated in person than in the photos. There was no one around, no sound except the rustle of leaves and the faint lap of water against the shore. I parked close to the porch and carried my bags inside. The air was musty, thick with the smell of old wood and damp stone, but after opening a few windows it started to clear. The cabin had 2 small rooms, one with a bed and a dresser, the other with a table, chairs, and a stove. The floor creaked under my shoes, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. It felt old but solid, like it had been standing there for decades. The lake was only a few steps from the porch. The water was dark, with tall reeds near the shore and trees all around. It was quiet in a way that made every sound stand out. The splash of a fish, the cry of a bird, the way my footsteps crunched on the gravel. I stayed out there for a long time, letting the stillness sink in. The first day passed easily. I unpacked, cooked some simple food, and walked along the edge of the water. The air cooled quickly once the sun dipped behind the trees, and by nightfall the cabin was completely dark except for the weak light of the lantern I'd brought. I didn't mind. That was part of why I'd come, to be away from screens and buzzing lights. I slept heavily, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're far from noise. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and went outside. Mist hung low over the lake, curling above the surface like smoke. The woods were quiet except for a few bird calls. I sat on the porch steps and watched the light slowly fill the trees. I felt calmer than I had in years. But by the second evening, I started to notice things that made me uneasy. The first was the sound of movement in the woods. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe deer, but the noises seemed different. They were heavier, slower, like footsteps. I told myself it was nothing and stayed on the porch until it was too dark to see. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint sounds outside the cabin. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Every time I sat up and listened, the noises stopped. The woods were pitch black through the window, and my lantern didn't throw enough light to see far. I tried to relax, telling myself the forest was full of animals, but my body stayed tense. By the third day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went for a walk deeper into the woods, following a faint trail, but the entire time I felt like something was behind me. Every time I turned, there was nothing, only trees. When I got back, I checked around the cabin, walking a slow circle, but I found nothing unusual. The ground was uneven and covered in pine needles, so if there had been tracks, I couldn't see them. That night, something tapped against the wall. It was soft but distinct, like a knuckle or a stick hitting the wood. I froze in bed and held my breath. The sound came again, higher this time, near the window. My skin crawled. I didn't move. After a while, the sound stopped, and I stayed awake until morning. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I fished at the lake, cooked, and read a book I'd brought, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the tree line, waiting to see something move. At one point, I was sure I spotted a shape between the trees. A pale blur, gone as soon as I looked straight at it. My stomach dropped. I packed up early and went inside, locking the door even though the lock was old and flimsy. That evening, I decided to stay awake as long as I could, to see if I could catch whatever was out there. I kept the lantern low and sat by the window, staring out at the dark. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of insects. Just when I thought I had imagined it all, I saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was too dark to make out details, but it was tall, human-shaped. My chest tightened. I couldn't move. The figure didn't come closer. It just stood there, motionless, watching the cabin. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. When I blinked, it was gone. The next morning, I found something in the dirt near the porch. A footprint. Not deep, but clear enough to see it wasn't mine. It was bare, no shoe tread, just toes and a heel. The size was close to mine, maybe a little bigger. My stomach knotted. Someone had been there. Someone had stood outside the cabin, watching. The thought followed me all day. I checked the woods again, looking for more prints, but the ground swallowed them up. The air felt heavier, the silence sharper. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. By afternoon, I was thinking about leaving, but the dirt road was rough, and the nearest town was hours away. I told myself I'd just stay one more night and then go. That night was the worst. I barely let the lantern go out. I lay awake, heart racing at every noise. Around midnight, I heard it again, the tapping. This time it moved along the wall, slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to stay still, though every instinct screamed to run. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of the door handle. Metal shifting, testing. My skin prickled. The door didn't open, but whoever it was had tried. When the sun finally rose, I packed everything in a rush. I didn't care about food or clothes. I just stuffed what I could into bags and hauled them to the car. I didn't look back at the cabin as I left. The dirt road seemed longer than before. Every bump and scrape made me grip the wheel tighter. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone running behind me, but the road stayed empty. By the time I reached the main highway, I was shaking. My chest hurt from how hard my heart had been pounding. I drove until I reached the town and stopped at the gas station. For the first time in days, I saw other people. It felt strange, almost unreal, like I'd stepped back into another world. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I just filled up the car, bought some water, and kept driving until I got home. Later, when I unpacked, I found something that made me cold all over. In the side pocket of my backpack, tucked deep where I hadn't put it, was a strip of cloth. Faded, torn, smelling of earth. I didn't know how it got there. That was when I knew. Whoever had been outside the cabin hadn't just watched. They had been close enough to touch my things. And I realized if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all.